Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome, Rebbe Mendel.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sitting here with Rebbe Mendel Kalmanson, Shliach of the Rebbe in London. I have some memories in London. I was in Manchester for yeshiva, and as well as the author of a number of books, Seeds of Wisdom, 1 and 2, Positivity Bias. Anything else that I missed?
A Time to Heal, the Rebbe's Response to Loss and Tragedy. And the last one was People of the Word, 50 Words That Shape Jewish Thinking.
Oh, right. Yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah.
Right. And most recently, On Purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can hold it up so it's there. So this just came out a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And we caught you on your book tour.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to know Miami is a destination for...
It very much is.
I think the Jewish community is flourishing here. Years ago, I was in yeshiva in Manchester. For Shabbos, we all went to London. I don't remember which area in London. It wasn't where the yeshiva is. It was like Golders Green is maybe the yeshiva.
Yeah.
Another area in London. And the only thing I remember from it, we were a number of guys who went, and we each stayed in different homes. So let's say 2 or 4 guys in one home, 2 or 4 guys in another home. Then we all met in shul. By the second day or third day we were there, we were counting how many times people yelled anti-Semitic slurs at us.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't remember which area it was.
That's interesting. Yeah, it must have been a rougher neighborhood. I live in a different part of town, in the center of town. So just to give you a bit of context, our Chabad is on the street of Buckingham Palace. Or some would say Buckingham Palace is on the street of our Chabad house. So it's at the center of town. So actually where we live, it's a very high concentration of very accomplished and well-to-do international business people. So it's a strong expat community. A lot of Middle Easterners, to be honest, Russians, French. It's a real melting pot. And so I personally can only speak from my personal experience. Been there 13 years, never once have I received any kind of anti-Semitic slur. Really? And I look visibly Jewish.
Yes.
To the contrary, I've actually had people come over, either Christian and once or twice Muslim, and actually come over, in one case asked me for a blessing. I wouldn't say that's the norm, but it's a very international city, and where we are, it seems to be that the demographic that resides there are not prone to shouting at people.
Gotcha.
That said, it's definitely the case that there's anti-Semitism in the UK, as unfortunately there is everywhere. I think the big surprise late is the States.
Yes, that is coming here as well. Although I have not experienced.
Yeah, well, you do live in
right.
Florida in general. Is in itself, it's quite a very Jewish state, but I guess particularly Miami, Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, the anti-Semitism in England when I was there made a very, very strong impression on me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, when we grew up, I'd say.
I'm not saying not only that trip. I'm saying the time I spent in.
Interesting. In Manchester
England,
as well.
In England, and my mother's family is from France, so I've spent a lot of time in France.
Yeah.
And I experienced some, but it didn't feel close to what I experienced in.
It's probably because you understand English, so you know what they were saying to you. No, listen, it's not a.
My mother's French, so I know only the bad words in French.
Look, Europe. This we know. You know, it's the oldest hatred in the world.
Right.
I think the anomaly is the States. You know, when we were growing up, I think it would have been called the golden era. Honestly, when I was growing up in the 90s,
right.
I didn't hear the term anti-Semitism in a concrete way. It was more abstract. It was historic.
Right,
you know,
the pogroms.
Books, the pogroms, you know. Our literature growing up, what were we reading? We were reading, you know, Holocaust literature, essentially. I think Alan Dershowitz, he wrote a book called The Vanishing American Jew. And in his introduction, he says that there are 2 major threats to Jewish survival. There's anti-Semitism and assimilation. And he says anti-Semitism, thankfully, is a thing of the past. And now we have to tackle assimilation, hence the title, Vanishing American Jew. And listen, he's not a person he's an observer of society, of history. And I think he spoke way too soon. But I do think that reflects that period of time where we took as Barry Weiss says, we took a vacation from history.
For a few years.
For a few years.
Do you connect the two, the assimilation and anti-Semitism in the spirit?
It's a great question. It's actually the next project I'm working on. And it's not a book that I ever set out to write. There are a few books that I wrote that I did not set out to write. A Time to Heal, I never set out to write. Or, you know, people ask me when I'm interviewed, you know, does this come from personal experience and Baruch Hashem, really, Baruch Hashem, it does not. I was working as an editor at Chabad.org, and that was a particularly like catastrophic period for the Jewish people. It was the massacre in Itamar. It was labeled Kletsky, live Kletsky. It was just one after another. And so as an editor at Chabad.org, we were getting requests for like guidance. And so I wrote an article thinking that, there's something the Rebbe said to the topic, and I published it. And then I wrote another article, and then it just turned into a book. And another book that I didn't anticipate writing, but I will, it's going to be called, you heard it here first, it's going to be called The Jewish Solution. And it's basically the Jewish perspective on, well, it's the Rebbe's perspective on anti-Semitism, what it stems from, and how to tackle it, how to address it. And in the Rebbe's view, there is often a connection between assimilation and anti-Semitism. Perhaps we'll talk about that when the book is out on the next book tour. Because I want to be, because I'm still in the research phase, and
Right.
I like to be really careful that when I share something, it's
Especially if you're saying the Rebbe.
yeah,
Right.
that it's fully formulated,
Right.
Meaning I've seen quite a few references, but I want to make sure it's a theme. It's not just a one-off kind of point. And what's very interesting about anti-Semitism as a topic in relation to the Rebbe is, you can count on two hands, maybe 3, 4, how many times the Rebbe actually addressed anti-Semitism publicly. It was just almost a non-issue, which is, I think, something very noteworthy. It's a glaring omission. For a Jewish leader, especially post-Holocaust, Rabbi Sachs already speaks about it, and he says that he studied post-Holocaust theology, and in them all you find that the common denominator or thread of Jewish history and is anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. He said you find very little of that in the Rebbe's Torah. And he says it's because to the Rebbe, Jewish existence and survival is not so much a reaction, or should not be a reaction to the hatred of others, but should be a reflection of the love of Hashem to each one of us, being a fragment of the divine here in this world.
Explain that again. I didn't catch it.
That, unfortunately, the formulation of Jewish identity so often is in reaction to the hatred of others. And that's a very defensive and a reaction.
Like we saw with October 7th, it seemed to
100%.
galvanize.
Exactly, 100%.
many Jews.
There are Jews today that have expressed and discovered and inhabited their Jewishness as a reaction. That's a beautiful thing. Am Yisrael Chai, all of that is true and tried and tested. And the Gemara already talks about the olive metaphor or paradigm. The more you squeeze it, the more it produces. All of that's true. But the way I put it is that there was a famous American theologian and philosopher. He said that anti-Semitism is bad for the Jews, but it's good for Judaism. And the way I put it is that in the Rebbe's perspective, anti-Semitism isn't good for Judaism. Judaism is good for Judaism. And that's such a crystal clear position of the Rebbe. And I think it's time now, enough time has passed from October 7th that we can have a real, honest, and mature conversation about what do we do going forward? What's the day after plan? It's really amazing that the Jewish people are activated. But as we know, that activation has a time frame. It has an expiration date. Rebbe spoke about it during the 6-Day War. The Rebbe saw that time period in his own words as the Yitaka b'shofar gadol, the sounding of the great shofar. And the Rebbe bemoaned the fact that we did not capitalize and we didn't concretize the inspiration, the awakening, and translate that into something sustainable. And so I think that's definitely something, if I could say, I hear the echoes of the Rebbe's words as we speak in today's day. It's, Chevra, what are we going to do to really redefine the Jewish story, not as a story of reaction, but rather a story that's proactive, that's incredibly positive. And the way I'd put it is simply, we need to teach Jews not only what we stand against, but what we stand for. And here I think there's a major disconnect between Jewish identity and Judaism. That's, I think, one of the major issues today.
And when you use the word Judaism, you mean what?
Well, you could call it Jewish values,
Okay,
but not just in the loosest sense of Tikkun Olam. That's
No, what are actually Jewish values?
100%. I'm talking about, first of all, let's be very clear, Torah and mitzvahs. But let's use English words for that, not just use the Hebrew words, right? Living a life that's based and rooted in ritual, in connection, in spirituality, in faith, in kindness, in service. There's a lot of ways we can translate it into a modern language. You stop a young Jew today and you ask him, what do you hold dear? What's your worldview? What's your value system? A young modern Jew will say, a student marinated in the West will say, liberal values, social liberal values, empathy, inclusivity, you know, um, any kind of rights.
They might even say tikkun olam.
But that's the word they will use for it.
Yes.
But animal rights, human rights,
Yes.
social, all of those are tremendous. If you say to them, well, where does that all come from? So they say, oh, this is a progressive ideology that emerges from secularism. Now, that's the narrative out there, but it's an untrue narrative. It's simply untrue. I do not think that the West would have stumbled upon these ideas in and of themselves. If history teaches us anything, if you look back far enough and you know what the world was at the time the Torah was given, you know that there was no chance that humanity would stumble upon those ideas. So I think that the link between Torah, the Bible, whichever word you use for it, and the heartbeat of the young modern generation, but especially Jewish people, who are incredibly impact-driven, incredibly conscious of making the world a better place, a kinder, gentler place, the link is completely lacking. So imagine you can teach them that you know what your heritage is, you know that everything you hold dear, you know who invented that, you know who gave that to the world, as, by the way, many philosophers and historians have said, except that their voices are muted. It's Yiddishkeit, it's Judaism.
But some of them have taken an approach that seemed to be opposite to Judaism.
They see Judaism as actually the source of much of the problems, as part of, organized religion. The wars and the intolerance and so on. And there's no doubt that there are strains and there are elements and there have been times where it has manifested. But if you go back to the source, if you look at the Torah and you ask the Torah, so to speak, what is your viewpoint? Not having been hijacked by, but these are the values that come straight from Torah. V'ahavta misager, you know what it's like to have been a stranger in the land of Egypt. That is the rationale the Torah provides for so many of the mitzvahs that today we would call human rights laws. You have to leave the corner of your field. If you forgot something, you have to leave it for the poor. If you lend someone something, like a blanket, if you lend someone money and they give you a blanket as collateral, you have to give it back to them before nightfall. You're not allowed to walk into their home to collect. You have to wait outside the door. All of these laws are there to humanize the underprivileged. And then you talk about inclusion and so on. The point of the matter is, I think that that's what the Rebbe was arguing for, to take Yiddishkeit and to communicate it to the next generation such that that becomes the foundation of their identity, rather than reacting to the hatred of others. There's a joke I say from time to time, of a new Indian chief, and he's not well versed in the traditions. And so one day the townspeople come to him and they say, is it going to be a cold winter? And he doesn't know, but on the off chance that it will, he says it's going to be a cold winter. But then just to check, he calls the weatherman. He says it's going to be a cold winter. The guy says it's going to be a cold winter. Anyhow, he comes back to the people. They say, is it going to be cold? He says it's going to be very cold. He goes back to the weatherman. He says it's going to be very cold. This goes back and forth. So at some point he asks the weatherman, how do you know it's going to be so cold? He says, because the Indians are collecting firewood like crazy. So what's happening here is that this guy, the source of the wisdom, is looking to the modern weatherman, who's looking to him to formulate what that wisdom is. So I think there's an element of that. Another general thing is, I think now is the time to talk about Sheva Mitzvahs in a way that it was never spoken about, in terms of its universal value. And I think that's a key component in this book.
How would you say it?
It's called universal morality. I would call Sheva Mitzvahs universal morality. I think it's time we can start to have the conversation about a universal code of morality. And, I think that could become the basis for a certain foundation on which to build a framework of coexistence that transcends the individual particularism of each group, but also at the same time reintroduces the word morality, which has become taboo because of its connotation to do with extremism or religion or judgmentalism or whichever.
Right. If you had to share a couple of Jewish values off the cuff, not too prepared, which may not be the style usually after, what would you say are some Jewish values? And I'll say more on this point for a second, because I actually thought at one point to almost like a segment on this around two things, one around Jewish values and one American values, because I was watching, it's kind of interesting watching some things that have been happening in America recently. Obviously, there's been a major shift since the election, but leading up to that, it seemed like people using the freedoms of America in order to
undermine
America. So there was the idea of like, do we know what American values are? Like there are some bedrock principles, some are known, right? Like freedom of speech, what exactly it means,
Right.
and came about the right to bear arms. Like what are these values and what do they mean? And it seems like what I was thinking was that in an effort to maybe protect kids, to shield kids from the negative stories of the past, we weren't taught the values. It wasn't communicated. So then you have a whole generation of people growing up saying they're proud Americans, but then espousing ideas that are the opposite of what actually American values are. And I was thinking the same is true with Judaism. I mean, I grew up in yeshiva. I don't know that if you told me like a Jewish value articulated in English, if I would be able to say. When I first thought about it, I will share one and then I'll put it back on you, is one I thought like that it's an essential Jewish value, for example, is responsibility one for the other, right? Kol Yisrael arei from Zeh. Like that idea that we have responsibility for not only ourselves, but the other people in the world. That's a very Jewish value. That's an example of a Jewish idea. We don't live alone. We're individuals and there's value and sanctity to the individual, but there's a responsibility. That's, for example, the Jewish value. So if I had to put that to you, what would you say are a couple?
Well, first of all, I think that's a very good answer. That's a very important and fundamental principle, and it's especially, I think, relevant in today's world where there's been such a strong emphasis on individuality that it has created, I think, a false dichotomy where you either subscribe to a collectivist concept or construct, which is how religion was seen or is still seen, at the expense of my individual expression, etc. And by the way, organized religion, at certain points in history, really did practice the suppression of the individual expression and rights, or so you could see it that way, but it's not that way. You know, I think Judaism is very much about mutual responsibility, as you were saying, Kol Yisrael arei from Zeh, which is a halachic principle, but more broadly speaking, I don't want to use the word tikkun because it's been so diluted, but the idea, if you go back to the mystical premise, the idea of service, that we're here to serve, this is, I think, another very important and timely value to speak about. The whole narrative that we have is what we're doing here in this world is that each one of us comes from a different dimension. We're not physical beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a physical experience. So the truest part of us is a soul, and the soul proceeds and will outlast our body. So we spend a short period of time on this earth. For each one of us, it differs. What are we doing here? Why would a soul become embodied? A soul experiences no fragmentation. It's completely aligned with the divine will, etc., etc. Why put it through what the Kabbalists refer to as a form of captivity, an exile? So there's a mission. Each one of our neshama, this is very, very central to the book on purpose. There's a mission. There's a particular part of this world. In the language of Chazal, chelkai ba'olam, each one of us has a chelek, a portion of this world, is ours and ours alone to elevate, to uplift, to create, if you want to use the language of Chabad Hasidus, into a dir b'tachtonim, a gentler, kinder, welcoming space for the divine, which both divine here means Hashem, but it also means the divine in one another. Because each one of us is a chelek elokah created in divine image. So each one of us has this place in this world, geographically perhaps, but also demographically. There are a number of souls that are pre-selected for you to interact with and co-journey with, who will be your co-travelers, for you to be there for them, and grow with them, through them, etc. So that whole idea suggests that this tremendously tumultuous, disruptive, and chaotic journey is worth it, all in order to serve, in order to become a conduit and a partner for Hashem.
So when you're using the term serve, you're talking serve
the universe, serve society, serve humanity, all of which is an expression of Ani Nivresi L'Shamash Eskaini, I am here to serve Hashem. So the basic premise here is service. That's the premise of our identity, right? That mission.
But those words can be heard very differently, or maybe it's just to my ears they can hear very differently. The concept of service and the concept of service of Hashem.
Yeah, I'm using the term broadly speaking. When I use the term here, I mean that it's not, the be end and all end of my existence is not strictly my own self-actualization. Some people, or many people, wake up every morning and their main goal for the day is, how do I maximize pleasure and minimize discomfort and pain?
A form of hedonism.
Yeah, I mean, yes. And that's built into us, we would call it in Tanya Nefesh Bahamis, but that's totally natural. That's the default, that's the baseline from the Nefesh Bahamis point of view. And it goes through life operating with that ego consciousness, which seeks to do exactly that. Maximize pleasure, self-fulfillment, and even within that category, there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so self-actualization falls into that as well. So there's higher forms of self, but it's all part of the pyramid of self. The way I understand it is that the premise of our existence is that we're here to serve, to be of use, to be there as an instrument of betterment. Part of that, in order to do that, I need to feel safe, I need to be secure, I need to experience all the important ingredients of being a healthy self. And but then if I am not for myself, it will be. There's a part of us that seeks that stability, that security, the basic needs. But then what is life all about once you reach that level, that space, that level?
Right.
Remember that up until very recently, in human history, most people in history didn't reach that state of safety even. It was hand to mouth. There was war, there was famine, etc. So as a generation, our generation, or relatively speaking, when we use the term generation, it's relatively new that we can even begin to address or go deeper and start speaking about actualization. The issue with what I would call many of those self-development movements, and I would include also certain forms of spirituality, is that there is one premise. The premise is self-fulfillment. The question is how I achieve self-fulfillment, or what kind of self I'm developing, and what kind of fulfillment is it seeking. So you can have people who are very spiritual, but they're very egocentric, because that spirituality is an expression of their ego. They happen to have a very refined ego, and their ego takes pleasure in higher things.
Right.
Some people like a good steak, some people like listen to classical music. And then there are people who are trying to refine their character. But it sounds simplistic, but there's quite a big divergence here in terms of what's the premise of my identity. So just to wrap it up, a Jewish value, the Jewish value is basically anina vreisi l'shamash eskaini. Let's move away from certain words that might be triggers for people who've had very unhealthy experiences with that idea, because unfortunately that exists in the community. There's no doubt that principle has been used to actually stifle and inhibit and suppress personal expression. That's not what it means. This book says exactly the opposite. It teaches you know how to find your particular purpose, your chalka b'olam. Look inward. Look into your inner makeup and composition. There's a letter of the Friedrich Rebbe to Tzvi Einbinder, who's from New Haven, actually. Apparently, it's the longest letter the Friedrich Rebbe ever wrote about how to find the purpose in life. And it's amazing. It's extremely beautiful. He starts off and he quotes the pasuk, Sefer told this Adam. And the way he renders it poetically, actually, quite poetically, is that told us Adam. If you look to the early life or experiences or events of a person's life, those become the sefer, the book you should read in order to discover your life's purpose. And he maps out 10 points that you should look at in your own life that will help you discover your purpose in life.
Okay.
Put simply, in the book I expand on it because the Rebbe has many more principles than 10. So for example, look at your talent. What's your talent? Historically, we didn't look at talent as something that had a place, depending on the talent, but there's the Yigisa Bayam Valayli, you have to learn Torah day and night. Anything else?
Right. It's not even historically. If you look at the many educational systems, it's geared towards one outcome.
Correct. Exactly right. I use the word historically because there were certain art forms that were considered to be treif until relatively recently. So for example, art. There's a beautiful interaction with the Rebbe Mendel Lieberman, the well-known artist.
Yes.
He was very tormented about his art because he had been raised to believe that art was almost like it was a waste of time. But furthermore, coming from a world in which art was used as the tool of sacrilegious, pushing the envelope, the norms, the mores, the values of a particular conservative society, artists were always they lived much more, uninhibitedly, and that meant morally as well. There was a certain decadence to the artistic community.
Right. So maybe art then was like a movie now.
So the Rebbe tells him that it's true that art at a point wasn't, but the Rebbe said the time has come to elevate art. That's what I meant by historically. So we have certain attitudes that we inherited to certain things. But you're absolutely right. As a premise, you're absolutely right. The system generally is like a conveyor belt with a particular frame, and you have to fit through that, or you have to squeeze yourself through that to become what it asks to ask.
Right, and not only Jewish system, any educational systems broadly.
Exactly right. But unfortunately, that's not a very good and accurate portrayal of the concept, how this is meant to work. And here so for example, there's a story with Eli Lipsker who used to take off time from yeshiva, and he went to music lessons at Juilliard Art School. And at the time, Dan Holla had to get permission from the Rebbe to kick a student out. If only that lasted longer, but meaning the Rebbe would bet, it wasn't you couldn't just throw someone out. And the Rebbe said that you shouldn't throw him out. Not only that, the yeshiva should pay towards his musical education.
Right.
And he became, of course, the Rebbe's. He davened for the Amud. He had a choir. The Rebbe saw in him that this is your tool. This is your instrument. There's a beautiful saying from the Frierdiker Rebbe as well to this point. So your talent is your instrument to play the Eibishter's music in this world. So that's very much you. There's many other themes like that. There's your personality type. There's your passion. Why is one person passionate about education, another person the climate, another person agunas, and so on and so forth? So there's a human narrative. The human narrative could be because you had a bad education and that created in you the desire to bring better education. That's the human narrative, and it's not untrue, but there's a deeper reason. There's a reason you went through the experiences you went through that crystallized for you the importance of something that was embedded within you from all of time, which is a particular passion that's a spiritual clue or indicator as to your particular purpose.
So our stories are relevant.
Sorry? Our story's not irrelevant.
No, our stories are relevant.
Our stories are super relevant.
Perfect.
Exactly. Except that what we need to ask ourselves at all times is what's behind the story. So in other words, let's take even the way we look at marriage. Really effectively, if it was all preordained, what are we doing? Right? We're basically acting out hashgacha pratis. We're acting out someone else's agency. We don't have agency. So the reality is we do have, I'm not getting into the whole Bechira Chavsh's conversation, but let's say a person says, I want this specific thing. Some people, it matters to them that their spouse have a good sense of humor. For another person, yichus is important. For another person, their status is important. For another person, it might be their appearances. Every one of us has something different that resonates with it. That's a must-have. And the other things are secondary, a little lower down the list. So then we find someone who matches our picture, our image, our desire. Yes, and that's true. Wonderful. Well, who created in you the desire for this over that? Why does your friend, he's looking for something completely different, and he looks at you and he's wondering, what were you thinking? All of that's because the Eibusher built into each one of us the very things, the plot devices, I would say, that create that manifest in the particular conditions that bring us together. So it's a different reading of reality. It's a higher reading, and it's a parallel narrative that is not mutually exclusive. It actually it's the behind the scenes of the story that's being acted out. So the short of it is, you have many of these kinds of clues from location. So for example, you might think that you moved to this particular part of town because of, and you'll probably have a list of 5, 10 things that brought you here. And that's all true. But why are those things here? And why are those the things that matter to you? And why is your best friend who could have moved anywhere, why did he choose to move to a different neighborhood? Why when you walk into a certain house, you say, this is mine, I feel it. All of those things are spiritual, what we call netzutzes, they're the sparks, or they're orchestrations or divine whispers that are bringing us to the places and to the people, to the encounters and to the events that were designed in order to help us fulfill our unique, specific, bespoke, one-of-a-kind purpose in history. So it's so personal. It's the opposite of collectivism. It's actually saying, farkeret, don't go to all these external, teachers, leaders, wisdom traditions that therapists, gurus, life coaches. Yes, go to them for help ascertaining the constellation of all of the pieces of you that will result in your specific purpose. But where do you look first and foremost? Into yourself. You are the book of your own life. Read it and write it. It's pretty amazing.
I like it very much. Let me go back to one thing you said earlier about the service. So something I've come across, and I'm relearning Judaism recently, so it could be I'm screwing something up.
No,
But something I'm coming across recently is this, what seem to be tensions. I'll give one kind of physical example, but then it seems to manifest in many different areas. So on the physical example, we have the secular calendar, which follows the sun.
Mm.
Islamic calendar follows the moon, and then the Jewish calendar balances the two.
Hybrid.
It's kind of hybrid calendar. And this concept of recognizing the reality of both things, kind of trying to find that, like that
Balance,
point on the
synthesis.
razor's edge, right?
Right,
That
yeah.
seems to be a theme that I find within Judaism. Maybe it's Chabad Judaism, but even on this idea of service, it seems like that tension and balance is important as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I think the challenges with this concept is that you have to first find yourself to lose yourself, and sometimes you only find yourself after you lose yourself. Meaning to say, this idea could be used, and unfortunately sometimes is used, to the idea of service. I'm saying the idea, for example, of Kabbalah's oil.
Yeah, one can lose themselves.
Yeah, and then then you can see yourself as just like a little cog in a, you can.
No, and oftentimes it's an abandonment of self.
It's an abandonment of self, exactly. And by the way, I believe that, reflecting the wider history, I think that was the pushback to organized religion. There was a pushback. The pushback was that it left no place for the individual. And in its decline, suddenly you have a sort of a boom of individual. Now, some would argue to a fault. We live at a time where right and wrong is, the arbiter of right and wrong is how I feel, my truth. All those kinds of things. I'm not making light of.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking of the Pink Floyd song, "The Wall." We don't need no education. Or just another brick in the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it was a real pushback. So what I would argue is that Judaism was never that. It was never that. That was a misunderstanding of Judaism. If you want to get to know someone very well, what do? You go to their home, and within their home, where do you go? You go to their bedroom, and within their bedroom, where do you go? You go to their nightstand, and what do? You see what books they have over there, and then you open them up, and you see which pages are folded, or which passages are underlined, and which passages are underlined a bunch of times. That's how you get to know someone. And I think that's a good analogy for the great spiritual teachers and leaders of history. If you really want to get to know them, they all learn from the same books. They all learn the same texts, right? If you're a real Talmid Chacham, if you're a real Manik Adar, if you're a Gadol B'Yisrael, you know all of it. I mean, in relative terms. The question is, which book is on your night table? Which passage is underlined? What do you come back to again and again? What's your central message? And here I think, this was an introduction to one of the chapters. If you want to know the Rebbe, if you want to get to know the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said the way to get to know him is learn my Torah. He was very clear about that. You see, what are the central themes the Rebbe spoke about again and again and again? And there are a few Divrei Chazal the Rebbe spoke about, used, I don't want to say perhaps more than any other, but very, very regularly. One of them was that for this reason, humanity was created in the singular.
Right.
To teach that Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, the world was created for me. And far from a narcissistic, mantra, because there are many people who walk around practicing that every moment of every day. The message is, if you take, let's say, Olam, Melashon Helam, there's a certain place in this universe that's concealed. Hashem's presence is obfuscated. It's for you and me to pull back the curtains. Bishvili Nivra Olam. There's a place in this cosmic story that requires me. I'm needed. I'm indispensable. That's a radically empowering idea. Another one, the Rebbe said, this is really interesting because in the early years of the Rebbe Nesius, the Rebbe diagnosed the malaise of the younger generation as being that of mi ani uma ani. Rebbe even mentions it in
This was when?
The exact year, it was the early years of the Nesius. When I researched the
no,
book,
I'm not looking at the time frame.
Because I the source of it was someone who was at a Farbrengen who heard it, but he doesn't remember which Farbrengen.
Got it.
I think it's very important. Everything is footnoted because you have so much out there. And anyways, one of the benefits of working with Kahas is that they have a very rigorous review process. But back to the point. Mi ani uma ani, who am I and what am I? And the Rebbe, at a later point in time, I don't remember exactly when, there was a Mashpia, Garari, who asked the Rebbe, what should be my main message to the Bachram? And the Rebbe said the main message should be the words of the Rambam, are well known. The Rebbe, part of the reason they're so well known, is that a person should view the world and history like a scale of good and bad measured equally, where one act, for better or for worse, can tip the scale for better towards world redemption. Think about that. The visualization of that, is that a teaching that comes from a collectivist mindset where you don't matter, where you're just a cog? To the contrary, it's not just endowing you with significance, it's endowing you with historic, cosmic significance, to the degree that all of history, the entire arc of history, the storyline of Galus and Geula can all be manifested through that one single act of one single person. I find that mind-blowing. So this theme comes up. People look at Chabad sometimes, black and white. The picture of the kinnis, that becomes their... I know Chabad, I saw the picture. And that picture it seems to present a group of people conforming to a particular mold. To a monolith, exactly. It couldn't be further from the truth.
And you're saying go to the nightstand?
Yes, that's where you need to go. That's where you need to go.
Okay, so if someone sees that I don't call it advertisement, but if they got a WhatsApp and it says Mendel Kalmanson and Eli Nash did a podcast, so they're going to expect to they can expect to see certain things. I don't want to disappoint. They can expect me to ask certain questions. So for a lot of what you're sharing, I haven't seen you talk. I've read some of your books. I haven't seen you talk. So there's a part of me that can go and ask, these questions and pull out kind of tried and true talking points, right? Things that you say many times you speak. But there's another part of me that also wants to make sure that my listeners get the experience that they're looking for.
100%.
So what is on your nightstand?
Good question. I have a few books. It's unfortunately, it's not such an inspiring answer. If you mean my literal nightstand, if you mean my figurative nightstand. Oh, okay, yes. Fine. On my literal nightstand, I have books that I'm using as part of my research for other books. Because, I think one of the things also the Rebbe infused in each one of us, and every person has to personalize this correctly, is a certain sense of immediacy and urgency. The Rebbe used the terms in the earlier years, a fire is raging. It's a powerful image.
What do you think he meant by that?
He was talking at the time very much about assimilation. The Rebbe saw the numbers were terrible at the time, and there didn't seem to be a way to stop the tide. Now we look at it and we say, okay, we have a system. There's Chabad, there's this group, there's that group, there's tremendous resurgence of Orthodox, Haredi Judaism, education, schools, all of that. But at that time, none of that existed, or very little of it existed. So in that respect, there's a fire raging. And it's incredible to watch how the Rebbe speaks to the leaders of that time. The Rebbe speaks to a guy named Gordon Sachs, who was a very prominent Jewish activist. He was the head of the UJIA once. There's a famous video of him with the Rebbe where he comes by the Rebbe for $, and the Rebbe says to him, I remember you. And the Rebbe says to him, refers back to a conversation they had 19 years earlier. He says, he's like blown away. He's like, that was 19 years ago. He says, Rebbe, you're amazing. You can see this. And the Rebbe smiles and responds immediately, and what good will it do the community, that I'm amazing? In other words, that's not the important bit. It's what you're doing for Jewish education. So he came up with an idea to do an endowment fund, $100 million. We're talking about in the 60s, I believe. So the significant sum, of course it always is, but time was, and he was pitching this as, that will create a think tank, and the think tank will address itself to questions of Jewish continuity. So the Rebbe wrote to him, the Rebbe asked him to meet, and this is one of the few times, maybe even the only time I saw where the Rebbe basically solicited someone head on. And the Rebbe said to him, basically, I saw what you wrote, and the Rebbe said, now is not a time for think tanks. And the Rebbe leaned into this idea that there's a fire raging. And the Rebbe said, when a fire is raging, it's not a time to create a think tank about what kind of firefighters we should create. The Rebbe said, you go to the firefighters that work. And the Rebbe said, Chabad, we are firefighters, and we get the job done. And essentially, the Rebbe asked him to repurpose that $100 million to go towards Chabad because a fire is raging. Again and again, this theme emerges at that time. So that urgency that the Rebbe imbued in Hasidim, I think, I think we all feel it to some extent. Of like, what more? That idea of what more? Search of more. What an amazing term! It's exactly that. What more can I do? So that's where my nightstand. That's a bit of my nightstand. But otherwise, I think if you ask me what I draw inspiration from, Likud Sichos has always been a real major source for me. That was sort of my primary sources in yeshiva to get to know the Rebbe. To be honest, my marim were they could be a little more abstract sometimes.
Right. I feel that way.
Yeah.
No.
They're also a bit more mystical, and
Yes.
and they require a lot of also background knowledge. Very often the entire mimer is an incredible nuance and a distinction, a splitting of a here, of a commentary on a particular pasuk. And this pasuk was treated by various rebbes through the time, and so intellectually it's breathtaking. I think in the sichos you feel like the Rebbe is speaking more to our daily life. He spells it out much more. The whole idea of the bechein, the hayra, the relevance, the resonance, you feel a bit more. And if you go to the Sichos Kodesh, if you go to the unedited, you get that much more. You get to hear the Rebbe speaking, I think, in a very rich and a very relatable way. So those are the things that really talk to me.
Why is that important to you, to get to know the Rebbe well, to know the Rebbe?
Because I think I believe that there's all kinds of wisdom out there. I think there's a lot of truth in many of these wisdom sources, but at least this is very much a matter of belief. My belief is that the source of the truth in any system comes from Torah. Actually, the Friedrich Rebbe actually said this on one occasion, I believe, when someone talked about all the different systems, socialism and Marxism and the benefits of them all, and he says there's a kernel of truth in all of them, and that kernel of truth comes from this guy. So for me, at least, I think we live in a confusing world, and there's no greater source of clarity, and clarity is key here, than, at least for me, the Rebbe's teachings. And I also think it's a framework. It's a framework for life. On a simple level, I think there's a lot of. I think we live at a unique time in history. Why do I say that? I think we live in what we call a post-secular world. The experiment of secularism was done, and we live after that. We can look back and we can evaluate it. And there were some advantages to that period of history. Human rights emerges with greater intensity. And many of the things that we see, the moral furniture of the world we live in today, has evolved. But there's a huge deficit. And the deficit is in very fundamental matters like identity, like a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, a value system, a framework, a purpose. The statistics on how many people found their purpose in life is shocking. 40% of Americans they say they do not have a purpose in life. In Britain, 2 out of 10 adults say they did, 8 out of 10 say they didn't, and many young people don't believe there is a purpose in life at all. So you're seeing a lot of that angst, I think, manifest in a lot of there's a lot of the issues we see now in modern life. The Rebbe actually makes this point to some extent after the assassination attempt by, what's his name, Hinckley, a guy on Ronald Reagan. And the Rebbe makes the point there that this particular fellow came from an affluent background. So the Rebbe says, let's put to rest the idea that it's only people who are born on the wrong side of the tracks that commit acts of violence and intolerance. And that was the launch pad for the idea that it's education, education, education. So you're seeing a lot of that angst play itself out. I believe that a lot of the protest movements today, they are looking for purpose. They're looking for belonging. This is their identity. They're well-intentioned, many of them. And the point is they're looking for a cause. So we live in this kind of world right now. We're also looking in a world of authenticity. Authenticity today rules. You saw it in the last election. It was the podcast election, the Joe Rogan election, etc. So there's authenticity, and people are looking also for a way of making sense of the world. So
By the way, I don't give credit to Joe Rogan. If I ever see Joe Rogan, I'll tell him that he interviewed Trump after a lot of the votes were in.
Oh.
Like he didn't. He could have.
Yeah.
Yeah. If
I
he
think-
wants the credit, he should have done what Dana White did.
Okay, yeah.
What Elon Musk did is stand up for him much before. But
Very.
it was like 3 days before the election.
Yeah, 100%.
So there were others who interviewed him properly.
Great. But I'm saying the conditions are primed today.
Yes.
They're primed for a thirsty world. When the Rebbe spoke about the prophecy that there will be a time, Le'rav, there will be a huge hunger in the world and a thirst, but it won't be for bread or for water, but for the word of Hashem. We live in that time today. There's a tremendous thirst. And that's why I think, and what will fill that thirst? If you want to fill a thirst, you have to provide it with the right liquid, and for me at least, the source of that is the Rebbe's Torah.
In the context of like you sharing, you knowing that you're sharing something of value.
Yeah. In other words, it's what it's very interesting. In my subtitles of the books, I use the term practical wisdom a lot. I haven't seen it anywhere, but practical wisdom, because it's applicable, it's usable. I think there's so much of that in the Rebbe's Torah, and I believe strongly that's why you're seeing all segments of the Jewish world, of the Orthodox Jewish world in particular, are streaming towards the Rebbe's Torah. They've become so. I was at a bar mitzvah this past month of Shabbos. Some guy, a modern Orthodox guy, comes over to me and he starts telling me the Rebbe's Torah. This wouldn't have happened at some time in the relative recent history. This is happening because that thirst is amplified and it's been turned on and activated within the Frum world. And the Frum world is recognizing that there's a unique feature of the Rebbe's Torah. I think this is a critical point. There's a unique feature of the Rebbe's Torah. There's a lot of Torah out there, but you go to a lot of places and the Torah you're going to hear is basically a word play, another way of seeing a point that's so abstract. But tell me, how is my life going to change? To answer that question, a lot of people are turning to Chassidus in general, and to Chassidus Chabad in particular, and to the Rebbe's Torah especially. So I'm just highlighting, it's not just I'm looking for something. I'm looking for something that can change the world. Maybe that sounds so bold, but I challenge someone. Where else do you find that? Mind you, let me be very clear. Chassidus in general, you have a lot of this in Chassidus in general. I'm not saying it's exclusive, but there is a unique emphasis on relevance in the Rebbe's Torah. Think about it. I don't know of any other Gadol b'Yisrael who ends every talk, look at the sichos here, and asks one simple question. What's the takeaway? That's mind-blowing. That's real. That means that unless and until we can find the point of resonance and relevance here, we have missed the point, perhaps. We have not done the work of real study. And that has ingrained itself, I believe, in all of us to some extent, that when we're learning something, we finish by saying, okay, what's the takeaway? What do I get from that? How does that change my life, the way I look at myself, my family, the world around me, and my purpose and mission in life? Well, I think those are unique features that perhaps are understated, but are really creating that magneticism. You have just now in Israel, there was a whole weekend of multiple teachers sharing light. Almost all were sourced in the Rebbe's Torah. Again and again, you're seeing this idea. In other words, you could have argued that Chabad became more mainstream because of Frum tourists. It's true that Frum tourists definitely have got to meet Shluchim one-on-one and see their unconditional chesed, and that has shifted something in them. Because when you're a consumer, when you benefit from the love of somebody, a stranger who doesn't know you, who's there for you, whatever the circumstance, something shifts. So all those mini shifts created kind of a major shift. But all of that just leads to someone saying, oh, they're lovely people, or they're wonderful because they're very hospitable. Right. That's not what we're talking about now. You have now many different rabbis, teachers, mashpiyim, rabbanim, from all kinds of cultures within the overall Frum Haredi Hasidic culture that are now celebrating in modern Orthodox kind of spaces, Yud Shvat, Yud Tes Kislev, many of the Chabad Yom Parga, but also in particular with a strong emphasis on the Rebbe's teachings.
So I'll share something with you kind of from my own personal background. So I went through a journey with Judaism, Chabad, Rebbe, all of it. And at some point in time, that the way I phrased it is, I don't believe in God, but if I do, I hate him. Like, I don't think God exists, but if he does, I hate him. That was the way I said it. And then eventually I made my way into addiction recovery, 12 steps. And there, lo and behold, this God word shows up again. But what's interesting is that as soon as it did, then I wondered if it was in conflict with my Judaism. Meaning, I had no problem if I was in conflict with Judaism in a nightclub. I had like, that was my problem. But if there was an idea that was in conflict, like, why am I getting it from here? Especially if it was a spiritual idea.
Right.
So I came across this book it was by pure coincidence. I mean, today I sit with the microphone and I talk about my addiction recovery, but that's not because it was easy for me to talk about always. It was because it was difficult for me. And I realized the value of it, that now I keep doing it. So at this point in time, I was just coming to addiction recovery, and I'm seeing this God word. I don't really want to see it. It's further on down the steps. It's not like literally in the first step. So I said, okay, I'm just going to focus on what's in front of me. I know I didn't want this life of addiction anymore. And I saw people who were living well, and they told me this was the solution. So 1 + 1 = 2. I kept coming back. About 2 months into this journey, and I was already taking it seriously. About 2 months into this journey, I go to a rabbi in Fort Lauderdale for Friday night. We were close. I went to him for a Friday night dinner, and we had this habit of, not a habit, a custom, let's say, of exchanging books. So he gave me a few books, and one of them was a book, God of My Understanding by Shais Taub, right? Jewish spirituality and recovery from addiction. Anyway, over there, he kind of wrestled with this topic, which for me at least put to bed that noise, which I don't know if I would have listened to or wrestled with. I don't know what I would have done had I not come across the book, but it put to bed that noise, is that it's not contradicting Judaism, meaning the same Judaism that I didn't care about, it's not contradicting. Right. Anyway, I can go in peace. I can read these subjects comfortably. At least there's one person who thinks so.
You know, this Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, a similar point where someone left Judaism because he was angry at God.
The God you don't believe in?
Yeah, that concept a little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, so as I started getting more into it, I came across, I don't know where I heard it. Maybe it was at a recovery retreat or something, Jewish recovery retreat. Abraham Tversky. I think someone was talking about Abraham Tversky. Abraham Tversky spoke there also, but someone was talking about him. And in the early years of him talking about addiction, it was not a popular topic. Sure. And him suggesting that people go to 12-step meetings, especially that most of them were in church basements, was considered the worst thing in the world.
Sure.
So someone asked him why he does it. You have books on Musar, you have books on, you have Sichos, you have everything. Tanya, why are you sending people to recovery meetings? So he said he thought, and he said, you know, it's true, everything is there. Everything is there. But the only place I know where people read a book like their life depends on it is in the 12 steps. So if you find me a room full of people where they're reading Musar or Tanya or something else like their life depends on it, then I'll send them there. But in the meantime, I'll keep sending them to the 12 steps. And that statement made an impression on me in more than one way. But for one, it's true. That's the way we read in recovery, right? You see an idea, and the idea feels like either there's two paths. It's binary. Either there's sobriety, where I follow these ideas, or there's addiction, which in addiction circles, they say addiction ends in 3 ways: death, institution, or incarceration. Wow. So that path is going there. If we just, if we play the tape out,
that's where it ends.
So the other one is, I'm going to read this book. I'm going to take these ideas very seriously.
That's powerful.
Okay. So anyway, so I continue in this mindset. I slightly switch out of recovery, and at some point in time, I bump into Sichos. But I'm the same guy who learned how to read in this way, right? Like if I read something and it's conflicting with my life, right? I've made certain decisions. I've made actual life decisions, a house I bought or didn't buy, or other stuff based on ideas I came across or letters I came across. Like I've gotten comfortable making real life decisions based on books. Anyway, so I came across this dance that we're kind of talking about. With maybe we didn't spell it out clearly, but I'll spell it out. Is that balance between service and self-work, right? Which in general, I mean, a lot of the topics I talk about are personal development, and that's kind of one of the criticisms against it, right? Is that someone goes in the personal development work and you get lost in it. Similar to what you said, right? That there's a self and a self and a self and a self, and it's literally called personal development, right? Or self-help.
Yeah.
Yeah, there could become an obsession with self. So that's certainly one side of it. And at a certain time, I was playing with this idea that really the corner of the world that we're meant to rectify is the corner in our own hearts, right?
That's perfect.
Okay, then I come across this sikha. It's in Bereshis. I don't remember exactly which parsha, but it's early on, and it's on the idea of something Sarah being Tmimus or something, some word around that, and then brings in Avram. Avram, it says, Avram Zaken Baba Yamim. And the Rebbe kind of brings this topic of Zaken, is this idea of development. And Baba Yamim means, that practically, like his service in the world was complete. Every single day, what he was meant to do in the world, right? The external aspect, or what you called, like Lashamish is kind of to serve our Creator. Like that service aspect of it is represented by Baba Yamim. And Zaken is something that someone can achieve in a moment, right? He can reach an elder status, like the rabbi. Who's the rabbi who?
In the Haggadah.
No, there's a rabbi who he was not.
His last.
He wasn't
moment.
a rabbi his whole life.
Yesh kind you can.
It said he did every sin in the world.
Yeah, you can acquire the whole world in one moment. Yesh kind Shah.
Yeah.
In his last moment before he passed away, he did tshuva. That you mean?
Yeah, it was something where he asked the son to pray on his behalf. The son said, "I'll pray for me. You pray for you." Right?
Correct.
Something like that. And then at the end, he realized the error of his ways, and from his sorrow or despair, he died.
Yeah.
And until today, he's called a rabbi. Right.
I know what you mean.
Which in his lifetime, no one ever saw him as a rabbi. But that idea of being able to, how much that status. So in there, the Rebbe talks about this tension of Zaken and Baba Yamim. And at the time, I felt like I was leaning more in some way on the Zaken aspect. Like I was worried about my own personal development. And as you correctly pointed out, they can look very similar. It's not always the same. So let me bring it to my question. I'll bring it all around.
Sure.
So for you, so when you mentioned your nightstand, right? So your nightstand had books, which your literal nightstand, which even it sounded like your figurative nightstand, are books that are in service of, right? And the Baba Yamim aspect of life.
Yeah.
So as a child, I grew up with my father who was very committed to the community. Right. And some of us, I'm not saying me necessarily, but some of his children, right? Not me, but some of his children, one of 9, thought that
it was too much.
It was too much.
The expense.
It came at the expense of. So my question for you is, how do you balance that? As someone who's committed to service, writing a lot of books and everything else, how do you balance the two? And I'm not even asking for your kids. I'm not saying how do you balance it for your kids. How do you balance it for yourself? And maybe the question is broader, being part of a movement which pushes this idea so strongly of Baba Yamim, right? We're out there and we're doing work and service and everything else. How do we balance that with the other side?
That's a great question. It's a very personal question, obviously, as well. First of all, I'm still figuring it out, if I'm being very honest. Meaning to say, there is no doubt that when I have a free moment, so most of my time, we have a Chabad house, which is extremely hectic. It's very vibrant. There's lots going on. But we all create free moments or have free moments. And then what do you do then? There's no doubt that at this point in my life, I feel this Ani Nevresi L'Shamish, this kind of message from the Rebbe. For me, it translates as, what more can you do? And I see the visual, I see the image of the Rebbe. So it's not like there's a disconnect between the wisdom and the source of the wisdom. The Rebbe lived every moment that way. Now, okay, let's be clear. The Rebbe was the Rebbe, so it's aspirational. So the voice is there. So I'm dealing with that. That's motivating. It's very strong. There are other things that like I would enjoy doing in that time.
But I would say the hara in the sikha that I took from it was that the work is like to find that balance. And I remember saying like on the concept of Zaken, he said it seemed like almost like a straight dig at the name a little bit, is that there's the more you want, the more you have, right? So on the concept of personal development, it's never ending work. Right? We can never reach, he quoted, I think, something from Koheles that the more knowledge we have, the more pain.
Right, exactly.
Right, so that and the fact that the more we have, the more we want. So on the personal development train, it's never ending. Right? And so it definitely has to be balanced, but the lesson that we were meant to take away from that was definitely the balance. So when you mentioned seeing the Rebbe, I understand the image of him, but in terms of at least one of the teachings that I've come across is the necessity to balance the two.
So it's interesting because as you're speaking, I'm thinking, and I think that was the point, to have to generate a presentness. The Rebbe, one of the brachas, one of the terms the Rebbe used to give people, it's very interesting, was menuchas hanefesh. You know, a certain serenity, I would translate that as. And that's in other words, that's not selfish. That's very real. That's how you serve Hashem is with menuchas hanefesh. The simcha, happiness, the tuv levav,
Which means?
a gladness of heart, a goodness of heart. There's something about being present and being serene that's part of you, that's part of your service to Hashem. So look, I think the way I would approach this question of self-development, the way we're presenting it versus service, is that it's not versus. They're actually not only not mutually exclusive, one is in the service of the other. So in the first instance, I think many people are dealing today or allow themselves to...
When say one is or one could be?
You can look at it in two ways. One is that it's self-development versus service. There are two mutually exclusive paths and so on. I wouldn't see it that way at all. I would say there's an underlying question undergirding the self-development that will dictate whether or not it falls squarely into the category of service. I mean, let's remove that line and they fall into one category. So in the most basic sense, so many people today, we live at a time where we're allowing ourselves to recognize, to feel, to experience, to excavate the challenges, the trauma, the pain, some would argue of Jewish history at large, but at least if we're zooming in our own personal lives, and we also have the advantage of being able to do that. We have the luxury of being able to do that. We live in a time of relative peace and prosperity and privilege, where most of us are not struggling with some of the existential problems of history.
Yes.
This creates the conditions where, for the first time, we could begin to address some of the angst that we might be experiencing. Now, the question then is that to the exclusion of, or is that in the service of? And I think there's a critical question over here. I think that there's no doubt that if we will work through our issues as parents, as partner, as spouses, we will become much better spouses. We will become much better parents. We will become much better children, much better siblings. We will learn to embrace and to accept and to love ourselves much more profoundly. And as one of the Rebbeim, I've yet to see the exact quote, said something to the effect of, you cannot learn to love the Eibishter until you first learn to love yourself. And it seems the logic is crystal clear. If you can't accept yourself unconditionally, you don't have the tools, the paradigm, the frame of reference to be able to love another unconditionally. So there's no doubt that much of this healing and self-development actually, if done properly and with this focus in mind, and I think that's a critical point, engenders an entirely different human being, a healthier, more present, more giving, more loving, more mature, more empathetic, more present human, more connected human being.
But also potentially a more selfish one.
Again, that's where
potentially.
But that's where the question has to be: is why am I doing this? In other words, is this in the service of myself? Is this just one of my goals? Like, is this my lifestyle? I like music, I like the arts, I like theater, and I like self-development.
Right.
If that's the case, it will actually, I think in the end, it won't necessarily lead you to become a better husband. You might become a more self-righteous husband because you worked on yourself and your wife hasn't. In other words, you're going to see that could be another lens to elevate yourself above others.
Right.
And people in that space, sometimes, some people...
Very often.
Some people...
There's nothing like spiritual arrogance. There's nothing...
So I'm saying,
yes.
You know what, in this case, look at the effect. Look at the outcome. The Rebbe would say this in the spiritual context. You want to know if a certain thing is good for your spiritual life or not, look at its outcome. And then you can work your way back to see if it was the right path or the wrong. Here, too, you have to ask yourself, I think, what's the outcome? Are you becoming is it making you into a much more pleasant human being, father, son, husband, or is it not? Or is it making you into a more arrogant human being, self-righteous? There's a superiority to it. So the question is, what is it in the service of? But fundamentally, healing and self-development, that's what Hashem wants of us. Part of, remember I said you look inside? What I didn't share is that one of the chapters is all about your personality struggles, your vices,
right.
Even your mistakes. All of those things are part of your story, which then means that Hashem is pointing you. If this is your specific challenge, you know the Tanya, it says the three most radical words in the Tanya to my mind. Ulai lekach nivra. I know of no more radical words. But the Alter Rebbe is saying, he's talking to the Beinoni, who let's translate in English, he's the perpetual struggler. He's the guy who feels like he's treading water. He's not ever graduating this particular moral challenge, and he's just sick and tired of it. he thought that, he'll have to do the heavy lifting for a time and then he can move on. No, it just comes back at him again and again. Yes, there are periods of quiet, but then it comes roaring back. And here is the same exact issue I've been dealing with for 40 years. How could it be? And he's at his wit's end. And the Alter Rebbe tells him, don't despair. And then the Alter Rebbe says these 3 words. Ulai lekach nivra. For perhaps for this you were created, to struggle with this particular issue. Meaning to say, it's not about attaining perfection. It's about struggle with imperfection. In other words, put a little bit more boldly, it could be that the Eibusher wants you to remain imperfect and to continually struggle with that imperfection. That issue of personality, of character. If that's not self-development, I don't know what self-development is. So it's just a matter of how you're mapping it out. If it's motivated by the question of self, I want to be.
So go on the reverse side, right? Because this is what you're talking about is kind of my experience, which is like I started from that standpoint. Okay, like I got to get sober. It's the most important thing in my life to become sober. Like this, it. And then as I go deeper and deeper into this work, then I say, oh wow, this is the corner of the world that I'm most responsible to. Yeah. Be honest, myself, I connected very strongly with that idea. When I came across that sikha, I felt like it was challenging me in some way, where it said, don't forget about service. And it's not that someone on the outside wouldn't say, I was in service. It's not like there were ways I was. I probably was already doing the podcast. I was probably giving charity, but there was the bend, the focus, right? And it definitely shifted something when I read it. So I understand, right? If the goal is we're trying to reach this very, very narrow, what was the expression I used before? Like that razor's edge in between Zakein and Baba Yamim, right? In between personal development and service of others, right? That elusive spot, too much to the right, we fall down, too much to the left, like right there, just that perfect balance. Then coming at it from, like climbing that mountain from self-development, we understand the pitfalls. Okay, so now let's climb the mountain from the other side, from the service side, right? Which is...
Very good.
Right.
I hear what you're saying.
Yes. So how do we make sure to...
Excellent point. So just before that, I just want to wrap up the previous part. Okay, I would hyphenate them. I would see them as 2 parts of the same overall objective. I think the perfect Mishnah to reference here is Hillel's words. If I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And the way I see it is there's a sequence here. There's a sequence. The sequence could manifest in time. There are certain times in life, stages in life, where you're so dysfunctional, like you were talking about. Anyone who struggles with addiction needs, it's like you said, like your life depends on it. So at that point in time, you have to take any measure possible to get better, okay? But is that a means to an end, or is that the end in itself? I think Uchashani la'atzmi mani clearly teaches that if that's the end goal in and of itself, you've missed out on something very profound. All of that healing can and must be channeled into, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? I didn't come to this world just to serve myself, just to leave this world a more refined human being. No, how can that refinement manifest in the betterment for others? So that's the way, just to put a bow on that.
Yes.
Okay. Now, to the other point that is very interesting, because I have a few chapters on this. The Rebbe was very clear on this. Family first. So one chapter is to find the center, to find the focus of your search. The way I simplify it into one sentence is the Rebbe taught us to ask not how can I change the world, but how can I change my world? You see this again and again. This idea that Aniyah Ircha Koidman. The Rebbe uses that not just as a halachic principle relating to the prioritization of material, financial philanthropy, but as a means and a paradigm through which to understand, or a template for how to allocate our resources of time, of energy, expertise, and so on and so forth. And it always comes back to the Aniyah Ircha, starting with family, concentric circles going outward. Your community, another community, your people, other people, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot about this. This goes back to the Friedrich Rebbe's letter to Einbinter. There he says one of the 10 points is actually the family you are born to. The way I see that is that your first responsibility is to the family you were born into. What does that mean in real terms? It means that your primary shlichus, your primary mission in this universe is to look after, is to shepherd, is to shape, is to support, is to nourish the people in your immediate family circle or family unit. It's fascinating to me that there are a number of accounts.
Oh, it's funny. I came to a completely different conclusion. Right. I'm saying just look at, climbing the mountain from the other side.
No, what I'm trying to say is sometimes we interpret the word service as global efforts to better mankind or the community, or in the Shlichus context, in Chabad, the Jewish people in my wider
Right.
area. And the Rebbe is saying, so there are numerous cases where the Rebbe told Shluchim, including Rabbi Garari in Buffalo, but there are many instances where the Rebbe said, the Rebbe gave them a bracha for Shlichus, and the Rebbe said, and all of this should lead to the Iker HaShlichus, which is to raise your children with Yiddish Shlichus and the Shenachas. What does that mean? You're about to go out, and ostensibly the mission statement, the remit is to touch and uplift every Jew in your neighborhood, in your community, in your town, in your city, in your state. The Iker Shlichus, not an ancillary or secondary, or once you're done that. No, the Iker Shlichus is that within all of that, you're raising your children in a manner that's true to the values of Torah, Mitzvahs, and Chassidus.
Right.
So I find that to be a really important. The Rebbe didn't use words lightly. Ikar Shlichus then means that the Ikar Shlichus in life at large means the people in your immediate environment, starting with your family. There's many, many, many stories. It's actually extremely inspiring. In the relational context, there's a very interesting letter of the Rebbe to a person who was struggling with shalom bayis, with marital strife. And I think it's very important to state that whenever you quote a letter, you have to make clear that this letter was written to a particular individual. And to the best of my knowledge, unless the Rebbe said something is relevant to everyone at any time, at every time, and the Rebbe doesn't usually say that, what it means is that it was particular to this person. That said, I do include it because there's a theme, and when I see it again and again and again, it becomes something I think it's worth sharing. But I say this specifically in this context because we're talking about marriage. And I think it's important to note that there are times when a person has to seek the guidance in their life, and there are times where the best thing, that what Hashem wants of you in that particular relationship is actually to dissolve a relationship. I think it's important to share that whenever I share something like really powerful, that the Rebbe said to a particular individual, and you'll soon see what I mean when I spell this out. So it seems like this guy must have written to the Rebbe a number of times because the Rebbe is like sort of continuing a conversation with him. And the Rebbe says to him like this: we now know, based on the teachings of the Arizal, that the souls that exist in our time have, I believe the Rebbe might have said all or largely, already been here before. Which is to say, we are all here as part of a Gilgal, a reincarnation, here to complete a task that wasn't completed or we left unfinished in a previous lifetime. And the Rebbe says, and this is a critical point, the most difficult challenge in your life is likely the area that you didn't complete in a previous lifetime that you need to finish in this lifetime. And hence the Rebbe says, if your challenge is not in relation to Torah mitzvahs, that is because in previous lifetimes you completed or you fulfilled Torah mitzvahs accordingly. If your challenge in this lifetime is shalom bayis, it's a sure indicator that in a previous lifetime you compromised, you undermined, you didn't live up to your fullest potential in the realm of shalom bayis. In short, the way I understand this letter, the Rebbe is pointing to this man and he's saying, I will tell you why your soul is in this world. It's in order to actually fix the marriage you're in. That's why I gave you the disclaimer, because there will be times where that's not true for someone.
Right.
So, okay, I just want to be clear. But back to this particular individual and this letter, it's a very powerful idea. That this idea of look into your life circumstances, look at the people Hashem placed squarely in your orbit, squarely in your path, and you will find your purpose in life. And actually, sometimes, or maybe most of the time, it will be the most difficult things you come up against that are the things that are most important and integral to your purpose in life.
Right.
So that's the theme to the people who are thinking, today, when you talk about purpose and impact, and you stop an average human, they look at the most purposeful people as people who won Nobel Prizes, or people who have, brought water or irrigation systems to Africa, etc. There's a certain globalization of the concept of impact. You know, I put in the book that Spider-Man used to be your neighborhood hero. Today, he's not your neighborhood hero. He's fixing entire galaxies and universes. Because today we look at impact in such grandiose terms. Again, ask not how can I change the world. Ask how can I change my world.
When you say my world, you like my family.
My family, but also my immediate environment, the people who, by divine providence, Hashem put into your life. And the places who, by divine providence, Hashem brought you to. There's an amazing story where there's a man came to see the Rebbe in his later years, and the Rebbe asked him, what's doing with the mikveh in New Zealand? He turned white. When the Rebbe wasn't Rebbe, the Rebbe was in President Street, he was living there, that was his home. He met this guy in an elevator, and the guy told him that he's going to travel for business to New Zealand. And the Rebbe said, I heard that there's no mikveh in New Zealand. See to it that you should inspire the community to do a mikveh. Maybe it was 30 or 40 years had passed. And the guy was blown away by the Rebbe's memory. When he shared the story with his Rebbe, his Rebbe said, I'm less impressed by the memory. I'm more impressed that for 30, 40 years, the Rebbe was thinking about a part of the world that didn't have a mikveh. That was on his mind. So what the Rebbe is saying to this guy is, you might be going there for business because you think you can only get this thing there. And no, there's a deeper reason you're there. There's sparks that have your name on it. Your signature sparks are there. So that principle manifests in so many aspects of your life. Your social circle, the people who B'Hashgacha Pratis Hashem put into your life. If you ask at any given time, what's the deeper reason or purpose or objective in this encounter, this event, or this relationship, that will lead you to refine the focus of your search for and fulfillment of your personal purpose. So back to the point of service, again, naturally we tend to widen the lens. And I think in many times the Rebbe sharpened the lens, focused the lens. There's a story with Rabbi Lipsker of Bell Harbor, who, as we all know, is a legend in the world of shlichus, and he's an extremely eloquent individual. And at a particular point in time, there was one of his balabatim, one of his friends and supporters said, you're so good, I want you to go global. And he said, I'm willing to support an initiative where, your teachings are globalized. I don't know all the details because he doesn't share this in the interview, but essentially he wrote to the Rebbe that this would have meant compromising on his main shlichus at the time, which was to build a community in his Makam HaShlichus. And as global as the Rebbe was and is, and there was no one more global in the Jewish world than the Rebbe told him that if that would come at the expense of your immediate circle, then that should be your first priority, because the way, I'm paraphrasing, which shlichus works is you touch one person at a time, and you touch them deeply, and that's how we change the world. So again and again, you see this theme, and that's where I say that for those who...
How do you balance those two in your world?
It's a work in progress. I'll be very honest, I struggled with it much more earlier on. And...
just be clear on my question, because you understood it, but just in case someone listening doesn't,
sure.
It's how do you balance the global impact that you have through your books and the shlichus that you have with your community?
Oh, okay. I understood a bit more on a personal level, family versus community.
Oh,
but
no,
you
no.
made it as community.
Oh,
So-
because specifically to Rabbi Lipsker, the guidance
Yes,
was...
correct.
Yes.
So look, in reality, I'm here on a speaking tour.
Right.
I do one speaking tour per book. Although when I can, I take invitations, but I don't get to travel that much for the sort of the books and the more global outreach content, because it's so busy in the community. I have to say I do struggle with this, and over the time, I have asked different mashpiyim what they believe is the right balance, and I'm still working that out. So it's an ongoing. It's an excellent question. It's a real tension, especially in the world now of podcasts, in the world of social media, in the world of the internet, where really and truly your impact could be global. I struggle with this, so I don't have the right answer just yet, and I'll come back to you when I have a clarity.
Okay, so I want to share something, because I feel like there's probably an attempt on both our sides to get to the same place, and we're climbing the mountain from opposite sides, right? So meaning me from the personal development, like I said, I did a TED Talk a number of years ago, and I shared at the end, my number one goal is to never watch porn again. And while it's shifted today it's not, I don't think about porn, I don't think about not watching porn, it's not on my radar today. At that point in time, I understood that was the building block for me having a functional life.
Mm-hmm.
a functional life would mean, a family, a business, all of those things. Even though, like I said, on the outside, there were some of these things that were being held together, but I knew long term it was not sustainable. Okay, so when I heard that example you gave you said the Friedrich Rebbe said to a guy, Einbinder,
Yeah.
right, about the number of different things that he can find in his life. One of the things is the family he was born into. You said his specific talents earlier in the conversation, and then the family he was born into. So I heard that in a complete different way, and I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So the way you interpret it was from the service angle, that the people I'm meant to have an impact on
Right.
are these. So I heard it on a becoming angle. So I'll share a personal story. A few weeks ago, some guy reaches out to me. He's working on a project. I don't think he'd mind if I shared. Maybe on the contrary, he would be happy if I did. It's a AI tool to help with like mental health and trauma and different things. And he asked would I try the tool. And the tool it's called What If. Okay, What If. And what you do with it is you have a chat with AI, and it's an AI who's, I guess, which is fed a lot of information on mental health and trauma and awareness, things like that. And it said, like, let's create a what if scenario for you, and we'll dance with this. Okay. So it starts conversation. How you doing today? How do you feel? What's going on? What's at work? And you feel like you're having a conversation with another person. It's very real, and they're answering questions and asking back and forth. And then it's, okay, what is the question you want to ask today? So I didn't have some sort of grand question, like, I don't know, what would have happened if I never developed an addiction, or like some of these maybe bigger questions. I just asked, what was on my mind was, what if I was never born where I was born? Where I was born, right? And what I meant by that was my family. So I grew up in a large family, right? I grew up from community. I grew up in America, right? So these were my dynamics. I've often wondered, like, if I was born in Gaza, would I be shooting a rocket, right? That's a reasonable question to ask oneself. Like, how true am I to any of my beliefs, or is it just because I was born? So that was my what if question. And as it started, like, pulling me through different scenarios and understanding how I grew up, something clicked for me, okay? And what clicked for me was that what my experience as a child was, I'm not saying my siblings would have had the same, my experience as a child was there was a lot of noise around me, and the noise was in the form of certainty. Everyone knew exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Okay, there was no questions. This is the halacha. My father spoke with definition, in a definitive way. My mother spoke in a definitive way. A lot of my siblings spoke in a definitive way. The rabbi spoke. The teacher spoke. There wasn't. If you went to someone, it wasn't. There's different paths. If you go here, you may bump into here. If you go here, you may bump into that. These are the pros and cons of each. There were no pros and cons in my world. Okay, there were rights and wrongs. Right? And being forced to hear all of those things, it felt to me, my experience of it was a tremendous amount of noise. And what I felt through that process was that it was teaching me to become someone who can think clearly with a lot of noise. So whether that's useful in business or whether it's useful in life, is there could be a lot of noise. And my upbringing, one of the things that it gave me was to think clearly, to think kind of maybe in some way to my own.
Beat to your own drum.
Yeah, but like to find that thing inside me. Because
was real to you.
Right. The problem with when people have certainty is two people can share opposites with certainty. Right. Right. So even if you go to a rabbi, they'll tell halacha this, halacha that, right? The exact. But I felt like I grew up in a culture where people spoke with certainty. We were sure, like, this is right, this is wrong, do this, do that. So if I listened, let's say, to one family member who thought Miami was the best thing for me to move down when I was 19 or 20 years old, to move down here and start a business, or another family member who thought it was the worst idea, I could have walked halfway and then walked in circles, right? So at some point in time, I had to find the answer within. Yeah. That's what I felt like. And I felt like it was continuously pushing me to become someone who can listen to my own voice. And some may call it march to the beat of my own drummer, maybe, right? But it's just to find that. So when I heard what you mentioned about the letter, right, I was hearing it in a framework of it was forcing me to become something that I may not have otherwise had. Yeah, right? Like one of the examples, like if the AI, so like if I was born to even a Jewish family, I said a Jewish family, if I was born to a Jewish family who had a winery in the south of France and I was an only child, right, and I had plenty of time to contemplate it on my own with nature, then maybe I wouldn't have had this
Yeah,
this sense, right? That ability, I wouldn't have been forced
for sure.
to go in there and find my answers. So that's why
I
I
interpret
brought
it
it up.
exactly as you're saying.
Okay.
Also, it's that end. It's that and so many
But you
other
didn't
things.
say that.
Right, of course. Because the point, yes, in context, I was making the point that that's your first priority. But more broadly speaking, it means that the family you were born into, they are part of your story. They're part of your journey. Each of them, the positioning of where you fall in the family, the pluses and yes, the minuses, the deficits, the defaults of the parents, the grandparents, all of that are part of your story. They're all the cradle of your early childhood. That's where you're formed. That's your most formative years, and each one impacts on you and rubbed you a certain way in order to produce a particular impact. And in your case, I think you have absolute clarity on what that is.
So
And I think that's
right, I
powerful.
think it's one of those things. There's
Yeah.
obviously many, 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 but this was this context. But okay, back to my question again, just because I don't feel like I have it answered for me. So on the path, we're talking about two different scenarios, right? The end goal is this balance, this sun and the moon, right?
Yeah.
Which the end goal is how do I balance personal development with service of others and not to get
Right.
lost in one. So
Right.
I think you gave a crystal clear formula on the first angle is go ahead. Like look at your situation, and if your situation today warrants intense focus on yourself, then of course, like if you can't stop drinking alcohol, then
100%.
of course focus 100%. But you gave a good but. The but was don't forget the purpose, right?
Right.
You're not getting sober in order to get sober for yourself. You're getting sober with eventually you're going to come out of the cocoon and you're going to start sharing with others. And of course, that'll be balanced the whole time.
I want to add one little
What?
footnote here.
Okay, yeah.
Don't become addicted to self-development.
Sure.
Sometimes self-development itself could be an addiction. It could be an escapism. In other words, if that's causing you long-term to ignore or to eclipse the importance of the people around you, if that's creating a wedge between you and the people around you, and it can, then it's
Oh, that's true, right? You made 2 points. You
Yeah.
made 2 points. So one point was look at your relationships, right? So
Right.
if you're on a personal development train, and by the way, it's a very important point you're saying. I know many relationships which have fallen apart because one person believes they out-healed the others.
Yeah.
Believing you out-healed someone
Yeah.
is a very unhealthy idea,
Yeah.
right? So let's be clear, you said it before. It's
And here's the
spiritual
thing.
arrogance.
If you always have in mind the others around you, you're going to see your healing as a way to help them, not as a way to score points or to
Right.
delineate yourself from them, to elevate yourself above them. You're going to say, okay, all the insights I now have, now how do I apply them? And where's the battleground? Where's the main arena? Not here, but around me. I've
Yes.
achieved something. I know something. And that knowledge is there. Sorry, I just wanted
No,
to...
what you're sharing is actually very personal. One of my
accentuate
first, Sam Harris, it says,
I know, he's wonderful.
right, interesting guy, atheist, but interesting guy.
He has a lot of wisdom. It's true. You're right. But
Atheist and anti-Trump, but whatever.
Yeah.
Everyone has their problems.
very good on Israel.
Yes, right.
One of the most amazing moral clarity on Israel. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I know. I enjoy listening to him, but he gives a recommendation that no one should recommend plant medicine, psychedelics to anyone unless they've had a terrible trip, unless you've had a bad trip.
Oh, that's very
Because
interesting.
unless you've had a bad trip, then what are you telling someone? You had a good journey, right? That would be like recommending life to someone when you had a good life, right?
Right.
So until you had a hard life, don't recommend
right,
life to anyone. So my first terrible experience, very connected to what you're saying, is I went to a space where I was questioning everything. It's a very scary place. 1 + 1 didn't equal 2. It was just there was nothing that felt concrete. The feeling in my body felt like I was floating through space with no tether, no anchor, nothing, just a free fall through space, and it was terrifying. And as I'm there, so everything is up for in that mindset. Every question could be asked. Not only if I was in Gaza, would I be shooting a rocket, but maybe if I was in Gaza, should I be shooting a rocket? Right? In that space, every question is fear to ask. Right? And every question is asked, and it's very scary because we don't know anything. And as I was there, I recognized that from that space, even in it, right? I recognized that from that space, it's a very scary place long term for me to be in. And I was like, okay, like I needed a tether. And I said, okay, wherever this takes me, it was my first time feeling this feeling on medicine. Until then, I only felt bliss, rainbows, and sunshine. I was like, this is amazing. And when I felt it here, I felt it was almost like I made a commitment to the medicine that whatever happens to me from this place, right? I've just opened my mind in ways that I wasn't prepared to. I was just trying to get rid of my anxiety. I wasn't looking for these existential questions, but here I was that I'm going to be a better father and a better husband. And wherever I go, wherever I go, wherever this path takes me, as many times I do it, however many times it's necessary for me to come back here, which now is much less frequent. Although I talk about it, it's been over a year and a half since I did ayahuasca or mushrooms or any of the heavy psychedelic medicines. I did it for a period of time. I feel like they say, get the message, hang up the phone. I don't know if the phone is hung up forever,
Right.
but for now it feels in its place. But that message stayed with me was, okay, wherever I'm going to go on this path, and it got tense with my wife at many, many times during it, right? It got very, very tense in the marriage when one person decides to completely throw themselves into this world. It got tense, but that promise or that commitment stayed with me of, okay, as I go on this path, I'm going to be a better husband, I'm going to be a better father, and I couldn't excuse myself saying, I saw it coming in, right? This idea of like, oh, I out-healed my wife. Like we're growing apart, I out-healed. This is not that's why I say it's a sick idea. I'm being very personal when I say
I appreciate it. By the way, I think it's very powerful that you had that kind of presence of mind in that state of questioning all that actually channeled that you channeled that into there's a limit to what I'm going to, that this is all towards a certain direction.
Yes, and I remember the feeling when I did that was it felt like the way a boat may feel when an anchor just got stuck in. It's like, okay,
now
there's plenty of movement here still,
right?
But there's one.
Right.
So first it was like, I'll be a better husband, I'll be a better father. First order felt like two different anchors.
There's a destination.
Yes, exactly.
And there's a container. There's a container for all of this.
Okay, so this that you're talking about is okay. So we're going on this wild train of personal development, right? I gave a very extreme example, but it's a wild train filled with pitfalls. You can read all sorts of books. You can go on sorts of different destinations, gurus, teachers, ideas. Okay, but there's two destinations that you're saying that if you have this tethered, you should be pretty safe, at least as it relates to becoming obsessed with personal development to the exclusion of service, which is look at your relationships. And number two, what is the point of this? The point is not for yourself. The point is to become a person who can be more useful to the world. Understand? Like, so okay, so now the service train is also a very dangerous train, right?
Yeah.
So one can abandon oneself. Many kids have suffered mightily as a result of their parents getting completely lost in the service train. So someone who's on the service train, what are some of the anchors so as not to get lost on the service train?
I think it's the Rebbe's teachings on this particular point. I'm not pushing the book, but
no, by all means, no.
There's a few chapters.
I would expect you to give an answer with the Rebbe's teachings.
Yeah, no, it's literally this point. Okay, let me share with you a story. It might seem like a little bit of a tangent, but it's really, really, really the point. It's a beautiful story. There was a bacher in a Litvish yeshiva, and he try as he might, he wasn't doing well academically, to the point that he felt despair, and he went to see the Rosh Yeshiva, and he tells the Rosh Yeshiva, I just feel like I can't make it to the top level. And the Rosh Yeshiva told him, look, in life and in the world, there's two kinds of people. There are the Rosh Yeshivas, and then there are the ones who support the Rosh Yeshivas. Because it seems, based on your experience, that you're not going to be a Rosh Yeshiva, but at least you could be a supporter of a Rosh Yeshiva. How does that feel, by the way? So you can imagine this guy, he is in this absolute despair because the community that he was raised in.
It feels like someone fell off the mountain on one side.
And it's still rolling. Right. And, imagine you grow up in that kind of a community. You're incubated by this aspiration, this she'ifa, that I have to become a gadol, I have to become a Rosh Yeshiva. That's the definition of success. All else is failure. He felt like an extreme failure. So he went to see a Lubavitcher bacher who he was in touch with, maybe came to the yeshiva to teach Tanya or something like that. And he shared his state of mind. And this fellow told him to write a letter to the Rebbe. He did. And the Rebbe responded and said something like this. He said like this. The goal, the mission statement of a yid, of a human, as defined by Torah, is ani nevresi l'shamash eskoini. That's the goal. Now, for each person, the path towards that goal is different. For some, that path involves being in the, as the Rebbe called it, Yoshev Oil, sitting in the tent of Torah, either exclusively or in part. And for others, their path towards the Shamash Eskoini involves being a Baal Esek. And this this lifted his spirits. Now, superficially, you can argue this sounds a little similar. What's going on over here? It's extremely different from one extreme to the other. In the first modality,
one's hierarchy.
There's a hierarchy. There's a pyramid. There's those at the top, and then there are those who are the supporting act.
Yes.
But in the Rebbe's rendering, there's no top or bottom. There is no hierarchy. There's no pyramid. It's all lateral. It's all horizontal. It's all personal. Each one of us has our own track. And the goal is the same. So for one person, he reaches the goal this way. For another, he reaches the goal that way. But they're achieving the same thing. It brings to mind the pisgum that the Alter Rebbe has in a mimer that if we were commanded to chop wood, we would be wood choppers. In other words, if you're coming from the premise that it's about me and it's about my status or it's about my role within the greater community, then there's a hierarchy. But that's a human construct. And that's unfortunately a misunderstanding of what service of Hashem really is. Why do I show all of that? Because that's relevant to the person who gets carried away in the service of others and overlooks the people that are immediate to him. He has created an image of what shlichus is. For him, the image of shlichus is very specific. It means going to someone who's less religious than you and encouraging them in their avodas Hashem, etc., etc. That's shlichus. And then there's family. He's making a gross mistake because he's failing to recognize that your family is just as much your shlichus, and as we just actually elaborate on, is your primary shlichus. So here's a person who completely misunderstands the concept of shlichus. He has created shlichus in his image. That's what he has done. And it's a terrible mistake. As the Rebbe reminded those shlichim, the ikar shlichus is to raise children that with you the shlichus of the shenachas. There's a fascinating sikha on this, actually. It's not, I have to be clear. It's my understanding of the sikha.
Yes.
Okay? And I'm going to be a little more liberal in use my own description here. But the basic question the Rebbe asks is, we all know that after Sarah passes away, Avram remarries, or he marries. He remarries. The question is who he married. So the Torah says it's a woman named Keturah. Chazal say she was Hagar. And so the question that emerges, which is a powerful question, is how is it that of all the people on this planet that Avram could have married, he chooses to marry the arch nemesis of Sarah, the one person who gave Sarah such agmas nefesh that she had to literally ask Avram to remove her from her home.
He remarried her?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Keturah, according to Chazal, was
Hagar.
Hagar.
Right.
Was Hagar.
Yes.
Of all people, this
Right.
is the one? Is this how you honor the memory of your loved one, or is this how you desecrate the memory of your loved one?
Good question. This is the Rebbe's question.
Yeah, I'm
understand.
embellishing it. But there's no greater offense to the memory of the person you love than to bring in their arch nemesis, an individual who you need a divine intervention literally to adjudicate what to do. And in the end, the Eibishter stepped in to defend Sarah's position and says, Kol asher ta'amar lecha Sarah shma b'koila, and she was banished. So the way I understand the Rebbe's message here is so powerful. Avraham was the first shliach. It's clear. That is not only Kel Olam, he caused others to call out in the name of Hashem, as the Rebbe speaks about in Pasuk Lagani, this Shabbos is Yeshvat, etc. As a nefesh asher asu b'charan, the souls that they created in Charan, the Chazal say that Avram was Megayer as Anashim, Sarah the Nashim. This was Avram's main aspiration in life. He was the first shliach. He took it upon himself to feel responsible for every human being, to bring them tachas cham pi Shechina, to, as it were, transition them into the monotheistic tradition and belief system. So, every night before Avram went to sleep, you know what he was thinking? The thoughts he thought before his head hit the pillow? Let me stress, so that no one misunderstands me. I'm taking poetic license over here. You know what weighed on him from the moment that Ishmael was banished and Hagar was banished from his home? I'm changing the world, but what about my world? I'm busy here influencing the Christopher Hitchens of the world, the Sam Harrises of the world, right? The Richard, the Dawkins and the Hawkings and all these guys. Who was at Avram's Friday night dinner table at a Suda Shabbos? All of these kinds of characters and figures. He had to fight with them to even bench. They were so militant atheist and paganistic that he had to shake
Give them a really good meal.
You had to give them a good meal, but then he had to basically, it's a form of a spiritual extortion. He had to tell them, if not, then you got to pay for the meal. So he basically forced them into this. These are the kinds of people he's dealing with. People who bowed to avak, to the dust on their feet. They were idolaters. These are the people he gave everything for. The three malachim who he thought were idolaters, he welcomed them in despite the extreme discomfort and pain he was in, etc., etc., etc. Before going to sleep at night, there was one thing he couldn't get off his chest. How could it be? Where's my son? No, it's so painful. It's so painful when parents are struggling with some of their children, and this is ain't bias. There's no home that doesn't have this particular challenge, and a parent that doesn't know where their child is in the universe. Avram didn't know where Yishmael was, and the rumors that he heard back. The Torah says that it pained him, that he was pained on this matter, and he actually protested. He was willing to. This was the one source. This is the one major argument he had with Sarah that we know about. And the Torah records it for posterity to tell us what this meant to Avram. So he never left his thoughts, never left his consciousness. The moment Sarah passed away, the impediment was removed. And now he understood, now I can go back to finishing my shlichus, to returning to the main shlichus. Not just to doing good or doing right, but to making right, making things right. And that's why he remarries Hagar and he brings back Yishmael. And in the end, Chazal teaches that Yishmael did tshuva. To me, that's a very powerful image, and that's a powerful idea. The kernel of it comes from the Rebbe, this idea. And this is the message to those who become so consumed with a particular image of what shlichus looks like that they fail to realize that the ikra shlichus are the souls that Hashem built into your life by design. And these souls mean your children, they do mean also your siblings, they mean your parents. Because so often, the people closest to us are the ones that trigger us most profoundly.
Right.
So that's to that person who's on that side of the mountain. Don't get caught up in your image. It's the same message to both. You see, you've done something brilliant over here, Eli. You've helped formulate something to that visual of a mountain that I think has clarified that really the same message should be given to both the person who's stuck in his self-development and the person who is stuck in his understanding of what shlichus is, the exclusion of those in front of him. In both journeys, one can get lost in themselves.
And not look at their close relationships.
And not look at how am I here to serve Hashem? Anina base the shamash is koini. In the end, if the objective is to serve Hashem, then you have to ask, what would Hashem want of me? How can I be best utilized?
But in that way, I'm going to push back, not to disagree, but only that within the tension, the truth can emerge. Okay, so just almost like more devil's advocate. So in that way, you went all the way up. Like, don't get lost with your the people on the other side of the world. Get lost with your family.
Right.
Like, meaning there's the potential there for someone to abandon themselves in the name of the family. I recently did a podcast with Leah Rabashkin where she spoke about the Jewish martyr, right? The woman as a Jewish martyr. And then the question is, one of the things my wife, she often says is that, like, what do I want? What I'm going to do is what I'm going to teach my child, right? So it's like, what do I want them to do? So first is, should I neglect myself in order to be with him for a little bit longer? Well, do I want... It's not about in this moment, what I'm teaching her, is what do I want her to do when she's a mother?
What am I modeling?
What am I modeling?
Yeah.
Right? So that eventually when she's older, do I want her to also abandon herself?
Right.
Or am I going to say, am I going to say, I want to be there a little bit? And I'll share two ideas, which I think, because I think we're halfway there, right? Meaning there's two tensions on this side of the mountain that we shared. The two tensions are look at your close relationships and don't forget the intent.
Right.
But then on this side, we only shared look at your close relationships. We didn't share...
No, but what I was saying was don't forget the intent.
This
is the same thing. Who are you serving? Who are you serving? That's really the question. Are you serving the image? Are you serving a certain... I don't want to use extreme. Are you serving a certain image of self-actualization? It's just that for one person, that manifests in self-development, and then for you, growing up in a community where everything was shlichus, for you, that's your self-expression, that's your self-development. And furthermore, if that's your self expression, if for you shlichus is the building, is how many people, how are your events, if that's the getchka, if that's the idol you've built of what it is, rather than it at any point in every point in time, you asking yourself, Abisha, how can I serve you best? And the way that I was taught to serve you best is to look out for every single Jew. If that's going to be your question, then you will never abandon your children for.
But how do we make sure
others.
not to abandon ourselves?
Oh, and I count on myself in amongst my children in the same category. It's the same principle. It's the same principle. It's very, very refined. It's very subtle here. You're absolutely right. It's much more subtle because here is where there's much more room for error. Because the person who is other-minded, who's service-oriented, who has developed the altruistic nature, that kind of person can sometimes cross the line into complete where it's at the expense of themselves, their well-being, and their family's well-being.
So I'll share something interesting. I spoke with a guy, Maish Feiglin, this week. And Maish Feiglin's had a pretty interesting journey. He's from Australia, lives in Israel today. He's musician.
Wonderful.
He's a healer.
Yeah.
And he was a therapist, right? Clearly in the service lane. And he happened upon some psychedelic medicines. Okay. And what was interesting, which in the podcast with him, I asked him if he would recommend this as a good reason for someone else. He said he did it because he was curious, which personally I don't think.
You don't recommend.
I think it's a good reason. But he shared because he's curious, and what he encountered, like the truth that he encountered when he went to that space, was that while he was a therapist and he was giving, because he hadn't made sure to sort out enough of his own stuff, that there was on the surface he was giving, and on the underneath he was taking. Right? That there was something that he needed, like he wanted to be in that dynamic with his patients of I'm the therapist and you're the I'm the therapist and you're the client. And in that space, he was comfortable. He had a role, and okay, I belonged. But he said he went for 2 years without doing any therapy. He couldn't. He said even afterwards he went to construction jobs, and then eventually he came back to it. And he says, listen, it's still an aspect of it. It's not there. But he realized that maybe one way to phrase it in Jewish terminology is like mashpia mekabel. Like on the surface he was the mashpia, but there was another aspect where he was being the mekabel. I think as someone who's trying to climb the mountain from the other side, right? Not the service side, but from the personal development side, is if I'm calling to someone on the other side of the mountain, like one message I think is that the importance of slowing down, right? That if we don't have times where we go completely inward and slow down, then there's a potential that we're abandoning ourselves, and then really the people who we're meant to be giving, we're taking from. So I think that maybe is one good.
Very, very, very
one good. And then I'll share a sikha, because I think we should.
Yeah. I want to. Okay, so then I'll respond to that with 2 points if I remember.
Okay, so I'll share a sikha which is connected to this idea. So there's a sikha also in Bereshis. I learned a lot of sikhas on Bereshis. As I got to other parshas, it got like more dense and technical. Often it was harder, but like there's selections of Likkutei Sichos that they came out like the Bereshis. Like I've learned that one like several times, and I've taken it to heart. I read it. I'm not saying like my life depends on it, but I read it and made decisions. And I tried to read it like my life depends on it. Like I saw like deep ideas. So there's a sikha about.
It's a great line.
Avram and Sarah. I think Avram specifically. Avram, his name changed, and we never go back to calling his old name. Whereas Yaakov, not only do we go back to calling his old name, even though he graduates to Yisrael, but he's more frequently called Yaakov. But then on the other hand, his people are called Israel. So there's this very strange relationship with this name, where on the one hand, it seems to be the most important name given to us, Bnei Yisrael, more common than any other title. But on the other hand, he's most commonly referred Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, right? So what happened here? I think it says it's a sin to call Avram by his name. So
it's a lav, like a prohibition.
What?
A lav.
Yes.
Because it says you shouldn't, your name will no longer be.
Be Avram. It'll be Avraham. So my interpretation, again, of the other Sikha is that Yaakov is that level of like struggling, the mundane, the work week, so to speak. And Yaakov was there, right? He's trying to figure out the Bechar. He's trying to get if he doesn't get it through pulling his hair out, he'll get it pulling his leg out, right? The heel, which is one aspect of the name. Then he'll get it through tricking him, which is another aspect of the name Yaakov. Like he was wrestling with. And then there was a moment where he graduated from, right? And he's like, okay, like you're good, right? You have mastered your Yashar Kel or Sarkel, whatever, right? The different interpretations of the name Yisrael, but it's this idea of mastery, right? You've mastered this struggle. And then he's saying, okay, well, now that you mastered the struggle, right, now go back into the struggle. Right. And the way I understood that, was a metaphor for, there was something that happened to me early recovery. So I was addicted to various types of extracurricular sexual activities, pornography and other things. At a point in time through my recovery, when I started on the path going to 12 steps, I was dating the woman who would become my wife. And that was part of what led to me going to recovery, because I realized I couldn't stay faithful and I needed to embark on this process. So we separated from each other. And during that period of separation, as I embarked on recovery, my sponsor recommended I have 000 contact with her or with anyone else that's romantic in any way. Like zero feminine
contact.
Zero. Like I was like back in yeshiva, don't talk to the girls.
Abstinence. That's your sponsor.
But it wasn't only abstinence. It was like, don't even, so I stopped talking to her, right? We were broken up, but sometimes we spoke. I stopped talking to her. And then dates were off limits. A shidduch date was off limits. As far as recovery, 00000. And at first it was a very painful place to be in. It was like, it's hard as a man who has tasted it a little bit to go to a space of zero. And I'm not even talking about physically sexual. I'm talking about the dance of that, the interest.
Energetic exchange.
Yes, exactly. Just the knowledge that there's someone who's interested in me in that way that does something for a man. Like that was off limits for me for months and months and months. And it took a long time. And I remember talking to my sponsors like, this is brutal. This is killing me. Like this is really hard. And he's like, you got to do it. You got to do it. I said, how much longer? Like when am I? He said, I'll let you know when. And then months and months later, I come to him. I said, this is getting good. I'm really enjoying it. I said, I started going out to dinners by myself. I enjoy it. I take myself out on a date. Sometimes like, this is awesome. He says, now you're ready to date. Right? And I think that's the idea. It's like, if someone's obsessed with work, okay, so go out of the workforce. Like if you're addicted or similar to my Schweigen with therapist, if you're addicted to the stress, then step out of it for a little bit. And I don't mean step out of it literally, step out of it figuratively, transcend it, access this level of Yisrael where I don't need this mundane world in order to wrestle it. And then once someone has transcended it, then come back.
Fascinating. In other words, if it's feeding something unresolved or unhealthy within yourself, you need to break from it in order to develop a healthy relationship with it. And then once you have that you've worked that through, then you can come back and engage with it in a more healthy manner. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. Practically, I think that not everyone has the benefit of going to rehab. Like I never had the benefit of going to rehab in my journey, right? But I did have the benefit, because I wasn't married yet, right? I did have the benefit of, like financially, I couldn't leave the workforce.
Oh, I see.
I had too many responsibilities. So I had to figure out how to get sober without the benefit of going to a treatment center for 30, 60, or 90 days, which was an idea at different points. And many people do. I didn't have that luxury. Okay. But I did have the luxury, for example, of not having any communications with a female for a period of time.
Right.
But that's because I wasn't married. But if I was married with 3 kids, that wouldn't have been an option.
Right.
So it doesn't mean, I don't think it means necessarily that someone should hang up their life. I think it means that there's periods of time where someone says, I'm going to access this dimension of Yisrael, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to be completely happy doing nothing. Right. I don't need to go to the office in order to feel good about myself. I'm totally comfortable being home. And now that one is comfortable being home, now go to the office. Now you're ready to deal with the world and know that you're not taking from the world, but one is a true mashpia.
So now let's apply that to this question of shlichus, and then let me reinforce it, and then let me split it here as well.
Okay.
In terms of the reinforcement, we do see the Rebbe speaking a lot of times, in general, to shluchim and generally to chasidim, about this idea of aliba de nafshe. It's a very interesting term. It means for its own sake, or for your own sake. for your own soul, even maybe even.
Right.
And so to the shliach or to the teacher or to anyone who's learning for utilitarian purpose, for the sake of then transmitting it to others, there is a very big emphasis to take the time, however regularly, and retreat from that activity, but moreover from that mindset. Because is everything okay?
Yeah, good.
From that mindset, because when you're learning, you can learn in two ways. If you're learning to prepare a shir, then you're learning immediately for the purpose of what can I do with this? Or how can I share this? Or who can I share this with? And that's one particular way of thinking and learning and so on. And mind you, some would say that's the best way to learn in terms of that's where the greatest extraction value is, the takeaway value. And the Rebbe would say, Ali b'din of shei. That notwithstanding, the good that you are doing for and with others notwithstanding, you have to carve out time to learn for your own sake, for your own soul. And it's so interesting because I was re-inspired at the Kinnis this year to do exactly that. I have a shir with Shliach in Malibu in Kesser Shem Tov. I can't use Kesser Shem Tov very regularly in my shlichus. Or look at the Torah, which of course I can, but it's harder.
Right.
Sometimes, as a text, my natural go-to would be a sicha. Either way, so Ali b'din Hashay. That's the Rebbe in the context of learning / teaching and shlichus. That would be the equivalent of retreating and spending time on what we would call self-care. That's spiritual self-care.
Right. That the only reason, in other words, you're saying is that the only reason I'm learning this is not because it's useful to teach.
No.
Right. This is not a book. I'm not doing research on this subject.
Exactly right.
At the moment.
Exactly right. I struggle with this a lot, as per our previous the whole conversation. But then I want to split in here a little bit here. First of all, thank you for sharing about Maish. First of all, I know Maish from Melbourne. He's an amazing soul. It's very interesting. In therapy, I hear that because really you're meant to operate in a space where you're there entirely for the other, and you remove any kind of personal bias / benefit from this exercise, which is meant to be completely
right.
To help. So
I mean, the way he shared it was, practically speaking, today he's conscious of it, and he still appreciates it. Meaning he still, you can enjoy, you can appreciate working with one patient versus the next,
100%.
versus the other. But the way I would split that here is there's a qualitative difference between need and enjoy.
Right. Excellent. So now I want to take that point back to shlichus, and here's where I'm gonna propose something. I love what you said before about certainty. I really love what you said. I think that's a very deep point, and I think that's one of the things we have to be very, very, very conscious of at all times. We were raised with certainties. And by the way, the world feels safer when you have certainties, you know? But safer doesn't always mean that that's the right way or the best way. So, and then just to that point, the Rebbe would make a point of the fact that Rashi, when Rashi at times says, I don't know the meaning of this pasuk, the Rebbe would say, so don't say anything on it. Why are you saying, I don't know the meaning of this? Well, why? Yes. How is that instructive? How is that helpful to the Ben Chamish the Mikra? And the Rebbe says, that's very helpful to communicate to a child that there are times and there will be issues and areas where you don't know, and when you don't, be comfortable saying, I don't know.
Right, and even Rashi.
But I find that to be a very beautiful
I love
connection.
it.
But back to this point, let me share this story, and this is another theme, and I would say this is a Hasidic value, and it's a bit counterintuitive. You know the story famous story where the Chassid came to the Rebbe and he says, he was Chazer in Chassidus, and then the Rebbe said to him, and he says, I think I need to stop. Why? Because it's inflating my ego. And the Rebbe said, "Atzibel is also von der Wern, aber Chassid is also Chazrin. Onion should become of you, or you should become. Be willing to become an onion as long as you're teaching Chassidus." Which parenthetically is a very powerful idea of the Rebbe, which I didn't get to include in positivity bias. But the Rebbe says the metaphor of an onion is very, very, very precise here. Typically, you think that it's used because an onion it's very sharp. It has a stench, so basically, put aside your own character development and do for others. Even if the very thing that you're doing for others it's part of your. It actually does the opposite of character refinement. In this case, it
Right.
generates arrogance and a sense of, you know. So the Rebbe said the metaphor of the onion is very beautiful because the onion has layers. So in other words, if you peel back enough layers, you'll find that self-interest is superficial, and at your core, really, that classic principle of Chassidus Rebbe. But that's an aside. But back to the point, that's a very interesting story in this context, isn't it? Because what it's suggesting is that there are certain times where we put aside all kinds of calculations as to whether this is having what seems to be an adverse effect on me from a character development point of view. There's the story, there's a different story like this, a supporting story with the Alter Rebbe. He had a chassid who put up some philanthropy, he did a lot of soup kitchens. And at some point he says, I'm thinking of shutting down the soup kitchens because every time I go and I feed the poor, I feel so good about myself. And this is having the opposite effect of what should be, as we know in Chassidus, the Bittul Hayesh. I know another trigger point probably, whatever it really means. But the idea of self-effacement rather than nullification. Self-nullification is another story. Self-effacement, it means diminishing that sense of
I don't have a problem with the term today. I'm good with it.
I didn't mean you, but I'm just conscious that the words
that
we use can mean certain things to certain people.
Yeah, some people meant Kabbalah, so listen to me, not listen to God.
Correct, exactly. So back to the point. So I'm thinking of closing down these soup kitchens because I'm no longer giving sincerely.
Right.
And the Alter Rebbe said, while you may not be giving sincerely, I can assure you the poor people are eating very sincerely. So that's where I think there's room to consider or question how how this particular example that you brought in from Maishi applies in the context of shlichus. In other words, even if you have I'm going to spell it out. Even if you have an unhealthy relationship with it, the question is what's unhealthy. We have to be very, very clear.
I was talking about his personal journey and whether someone has to actually leave from it. A perfect example would be the work example. Let's say someone has an unhealthy relationship with work, and they say, "Okay, so I'm not going to go to work anymore." Okay, so then what? You're going to live on someone else's dime, right? Yeah. Work out your unhealthy relationship with work while you're working. I mean, that's obviously the best thing. If Maish felt he didn't feel he was in a place, but if he felt that he could still be helpful to people while at the same time working through anything that he may be needing or taking from them, that could have been most useful. Yeah, so I want to be clear, I'm not advocating that. I was just giving another perspective.
If we go deeper, this comes back to the same point. That chassid who came to the Alter Rebbe said, I'm thinking of closing down the soup kitchens. Or the chassid says, I feel like I shouldn't be teaching chassidus. I'm no longer... These are people who are struggling with what we would call self-development. It meant something to them. They thought very long and hard about how can I refine my character. And in simple terms, the aim and the goal of that kind of a work and activity should be humility versus a sense of arrogance. And if it's engendering greater arrogance or superiority than humility, then it's clearly doing the opposite of what I'm aspiring to do. These were very thoughtful Hasidim, deeply committed to self-development. Now, but here's what the Alter Rebbe was saying. It's just so powerful. He's saying, even those considerations are themselves, they can be the furtherance of self. Or, in other words, if you're helping the poor people who are hungry, or spiritually speaking, those who are undernourished or famished spiritually, and you're teaching Hasidus, if your main question is, Hashem, what would you have me do in this situation? If that's your guiding question, then you will give that poor person a meal, regardless of how it impacts on your self-development, even if, to your mind, it has an adverse effect on your self-development. So I keep coming back to the same point. There is one guiding question over here. And if I may, that's really the difference between in many cases, some of these movements of spirituality and self-development versus what religion ought to be. And I'm stressing that because religion can become exactly that. Religion can be a form of idolatry. It could be a form of self-aggrandizement. And anything we do in the context of religion can be that on a very, very subtle level. Even our service could be that. Even giving a life of service could be that. It could be creating, it could be a projection of an image. It could be living up to a certain self-image. If it's image-based and image-oriented, then it's not l'sham kaini. And if you think l'sham kaini, all of these various different questions can be resolved. with the same question.
Right.
And hopefully answer. I don't know if that, I hope that makes
No,
sense.
no, I
to
hear
you.
it made perfect sense. I think it's perfect that we're coming at this from
Yeah.
different sides because, like I said, that within that tension, a truth gets truth emerges. It's clearly you're coming from the service angle, and I'm coming from the self improvement. But I think we both have the common goal.
Yeah.
So in that, there's a certain truth that gets explored.
But
I want to share
critically-
something, one story quickly, and then come back. So, my wife is always careful to pack my kids when they go to school, like with plenty of snacks. And sometimes she'll say, she'll pack enough for others, as well. So my son was coming home, and he kept saying like he was giving away all of his snacks. I said, why? He said they were hungry. They're hungry, so they came and they asked me. So I shared. So I said it's good to share. Just don't forget to share with yourself too.
Yeah.
So if the 3 kids ask you and you have, don't divide it by 3, divide it by 4. Like put yourself in the other also. Like don't forget we're in other as well.
Excellent. Exactly right. That's actually literally what I was going to say. That there shouldn't that exactly. I think exactly as you put it. There's let me veer tangent and come back. There's a story with Uncle Yossi Goldstein, who he once told the Rebbe, and the Rebbe became Rebbe. He said, he was bemoaning his own spiritual state and saying, look at me, and I spent time by the feet of the Rebbe, like, what became of me? He was putting himself down. And the Rebbe said something to the effect of, I've yet to see a source that allows speaking Lashon Hara about oneself.
I like it. Yeah.
We tend to see, exactly, this is to your point, that, it says, V'ahavta l'recha kamecha. So we usually say, love others like yourself. But it also means love yourself like others. In other words, the way I put it is, if somebody at your Shabbos table spilled something by mistake, would you scream at them, you fool, you idiot, you klutz? You would never do that. Why is it that when you spill something, you suddenly say, I'm such a fool, I'm such an idiot, I'm such a klutz? So it goes both ways. And I think the critical point is the Eibusher doesn't need you if you're a shmata. Meaning you're not going to be the best partner with Hashem if you're underslept, if you're ill, if you're completely exhausted and burnt out and fatigued. You're not helping the cause. So on one level, from a practical point of view, you have to look after yourself in order to be the best shliach. But here I'm using the term shliach in its literal sense. That is to say, each one of us is a shliach of the Eibusher, not in its colloquial sense, the way it's used today, that defines a particular kind of shlichus. So that's one point. But then there's that idea of the Rebbe saying menuchas hanefesh to me is very big. Serenity. Hashem wants the best for his children, and by the best, my understanding of it means to live a life of inner peace, of inner harmony. And if you're living in a state of chaos and dysfunction that's generated by your shlichus in quotation marks, you have to remember that you are part of the shlichus. I think you put it perfectly. I couldn't say it better. You are part of that shlichus. Remember.
And maybe, I don't know if you'll go this far, but in much the same way that you'd say my family is my most important shlichus, then maybe I am my most important shlichus.
Yeah, I think there's and so I want to distinguish between one argument that's from a utilitarian point of view, because if you are not your best, then how can you be there for others? But I want to go deeper, I think, because intuitively I feel this is true. I need to really look up the sources for this to say that this is what the Rebbe says. But on this point, not only because of your utilitarian value, but because the Eibusher wants for you tachlis hatoiv, and if tachlis hatoiv involves serenity, that's part of your shlichus, to look after you and to give yourself that state of serenity.
Right. There is this, I think it's a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov that everything we see in the world could teach us in our service of Hashem, like our personal service of Hashem.
Yeah.
So it would stand to reason that looking at something through that lens of I'm helping someone, but they can be helpful to me through my service of Hashem, right? That having that posture at all times is a helpful one. There's a story Y.Y. Jacobson shared in a discussion I had with him once. He shared a story. I may miss a few details. I don't think I'll miss the point. So he said, someone I think went to Mittler Rebbe and asked him a question. The question was that he was struggling with attraction to dead people, sexual attraction to dead people. And he went to Mittler Rebbe for assistance. And the Mittler Rebbe was very perturbed and went to himself. If I remember the details correctly, YY said that he asked his students or his
Yes.
there, leave me be.
For a
Don't-
while.
yeah,
It was
yeah.
Ramesh Chazman.
Yeah, leave me be. I got to deal with it. Okay, so. And anyway, he was turning over in the room, apparently. He came out sweating after many, many hours. And he spoke to the individual and he shared something with him. Afterwards, someone had the boldness to ask him what happened. And he said that he knows, as a principle, if someone comes to him for help, then he's either struggling or has struggled with this same thing. And he couldn't find this in himself. And he knew that it was there. How is it possible that God would send me someone to help who I don't even see the similarity between me and him, not the present me, not the past me. That's at least the way I understood it from YY. Then I'm missing something. I'm blind to an aspect of myself. And then he went in to find that aspect. You know what he ended up coming back with? That yeah, oftentimes he would teach even if people weren't listening.
That's amazing.
Right? That he's like, I'm in some way I'm drawing
life.
energy.
I'm drawing energy.
I'm drawing life from a dead person.
Drawing and giving.
Both.
Yes,
right.
Correct, exactly.
Yeah, there's a dead person. He's not listening. He's not present. He's not anything.
Right.
But I'm drawing life. And in some way,
It's
right,
one
that's
way.
a
It's
subtle
one way.
Right. And that's like a very subtle way of saying, like, okay, I'm here. I'm committed to the service of another person, but I can't forget. At the end of the day, if someone showed up at my office, he came for me just like I came for him.
It's very interesting because the context I heard and understand the story is the exact opposite. And let me explain what I mean. I definitely always defer to Rabbi Jacobson. But I understood it as a story of empathy. I actually wrote it up once in a context of empathy. That the Rebbe and any Rebbe who sees Hasidim, in order, in other words, the license they took to give advice to others was predicated on knowing how that person felt or experiencing something common with that person. That was the grounds for sharing. So he felt I'm not adequate to share anything to you because I have no relatability here whatsoever. So it's almost the opposite. It's saying I have to find it in myself in order to be the best giver. And you're saying that it's the opposite. That
so
as part of the giving, there has to be something in here to take. Very, very interesting. Very interesting.
So I'm glad we're here. So
I don't think it's I don't think they're mutually exclusive, by the way.
But I think we're at this point where we're both trying to reach what I think is a very, very narrow point on a mountain. And it's very easy to go too far to the right and too far to the left. And it's likely there's two possibilities. One is too far to the right in my life, and too far to the left in my life is different than too far to the right in your life, too far to the left. But there's some, there's a little bit of daylight between us. But one of the beautiful things...
I actually don't see that so much.
Slight.
Yeah?
I think so. Like I'm always coming back to the personal angle. You're always coming back to that. But I'll share this. I'll share another, I'll share one more medicine journey over here. So it's it was a difficult one in the sense that it was beating some real bad character traits out of me, like very, very harshly. It was like, wow. And one of the things like at the end of like what felt like a beatdown, like literally a beatdown. Sometimes it could just feel like being pummeled to no end, hours and hours and hours. I'm like, oh my goodness, how could I be so insensitive? How could I be so wrong? Whatever, all these things. And at the end, it was like almost felt like a little humor. Like the thought came to my head, is like, I'm very lucky I named the podcast In Search of More, and not something like The Enlightened Man or something. Like I get to share ideas with. I'm on a search. I haven't said I found anything. I haven't said we're there, but we're here. We're dancing with these ideas. They're very subtle, nuanced ideas. And I think that's one of the aspects that I'm connecting more and more to Judaism. And especially that within a lot of the spiritual in America, a lot of the spirituality in America is a very like Buddhist-based spirituality. Like it's really like penetrated in meditation, the ideas, the culture, spirituality, it's infused. And seeing the daylight between them. There's a lot of similarities, like you shared earlier, that there are certain truths that start spreading out in many, many different areas. But there's a place where Buddhism is almost looking to escape the world. And Judaism is looking to, be spiritual while at the same time be here.
100%.
Right? And in so many different aspects of Judaism, and it's something that I appreciate very deeply about it, is it's trying to find a balance that's so hard to strike.
Excellent.
And I appreciate it here too.
It's a very powerful point. I think that in all cases, it's always easier to to lean to the extremes of things, of ideas, and to plain things as binary. I think Judaism is a synthesis. It's about synthesis. It's about paradox. It's about holding multiple truths.
Yeah, like we said, the sun and the moon, like that dance.
Exactly.
Which time are we on? We're on 2 times.
Exactly. So, and that idea of being both fully present and also always engaged in what this moment could bring to the next moment, that tension. The actual Sikha Babayam, there's a few Sikhas, but the Rebbe has this amazing idea that the literal meaning of the word Babayam means to enter into the day.
Enter into like time and space.
Yeah, to be fully present.
Oh, like that.
It's such it's an amazing, it's literally the meaning. There's so many ways to talk about being aged. Why is the term the Torah uses, in addition to Zaken, there's redundancy. It says Zaken and then Babayam. Why say the same thing twice? So some explain that Zaken is quantitative and Babayam is qualitative. But what the Rebbe says is that they utilize the opportunity and the calling and the invitation of every moment of every day.
Beautiful.
You know, look, one of the stories that really I live with a lot, that really touched me very deeply when I heard it, and I reach for when I'm feeling depleted, is a story where someone wanted to meet with the Rebbe. I heard this story from Rabbi Kotlarsky, Olam Hashem.
I want to point out that we're getting right now to that figurative nightstand, right? Because you said that this is a story you reach for when you're feeling depleted. So we're getting to that nightstand.
Exactly.
What has underlines? Okay.
Very good. And this person wanted to meet with the Rebbe. He had an issue, so he called up Maskiras. They told him, the typical come in 7 months at 4 a.m. And he managed to find a way to circumvent protocol. So he showed up at the Rebbe's house the next morning. He ambushes the Rebbe. The Rebbe walked from his house to the car. It took usually 30 seconds. He stops the Rebbe, asks him, spend 7-8 minutes with him. The Rebbe gets into the car. The Rebbe goes to 770. And unbeknownst to this guy, there were 2 Bachrim watching the whole exchange from across the street. They march across the street.
Upset at him?
Completely upset. They accost him and admonish him, how dare you steal the Rebbe's precious time. So he felt terrible. He wrote a note to the Rebbe apologizing for this violation of protocol, stealing the Rebbe's time. And the Rebbe responded with 2 points. The first thing was that the time that those yeshiva boys accosted you was during Seder HaYeshiva. It was during yeshiva time, so they had no business being there in the first place. But then the Rebbe said that there's a well-known teaching of the Baal Shem Tov who taught that a soul, an neshama, the whole purpose of a soul's ascent in this world, all of the turmoil, all of the dislocation and the disruption caused to the soul, which according to Kabbalah we know it's referred to, as I mentioned, exile, captivity. All of that could be warranted and justified. The entire purpose of the soul's ascent to this world could be to do a favor for just one other person. One favor for another. The Rebbe tells him, who knows? Perhaps my neshama came to this world to help you this morning. And what's amazing about that story to me is that that's how the Rebbe viewed every single encounter. Perhaps this is the one. That level of being switched on to purpose is extraordinary in the Rebbe. We are lucky to have lived at a time and seen the example of someone who lived switched on to purpose every moment of every day.
Right, an interaction that could be either benign or a nuisance.
Correct,
right.
Exactly. And that's, by the way, that's the takeaway appeal for each of us. What it means to say, and that's why I said that's the one I reach to when I feel depleted. Because when I'm not depleted, I'm engaged. I'm in. I'm on. I'm on. What happens when I'm running low? When I feel like I'm maxed out? Then
who do you see yourself in that story? Do you see? Are you from the Rebbe or from the guy who's coming to the Rebbe?
Takeaway point. Perhaps the next when the
right. Are you the recipient of that story or the giver?
If I'm in a position of giver.
Giving. Okay, that's what you're saying.
So that's where I reach for.
Okay. To
give me that extra boost, and the meditation, the reflection is, perhaps this is the one.
Right.
Perhaps this is the one, and then suddenly you're galvanized. You're activated. This is the one. I got to show up. I can't sleep on the job. Imagine, you're here the whole. So the point is that's, the beautiful thing about writing the teachings of the Rebbe is that, the more you get to know teachers and leaders, and sometimes the more you get to know them, the more you sometimes realize there's a disconnect between what they're teaching and how they're living. I said, generally, yes. Each one of us It's not. It's a very specific point that sometimes you might relate to.
Pretty much always, we teach what we need to know.
Okay. But in the Rebbe's case, it's incredible to see. Every single teaching is autobiographical. It's essentially, it's communicating, and it's coming from a way of life, of
Right,
living.
like who he became.
Was and became, and all
Yes.
of that. And I think that to me is extremely empowering. That in my office, the picture that I have on my wall of the Rebbe, there's so many. It would be an interesting question to ask people, what's your favorite Rebbe picture? There are a lot of favorites, but the one that's hanging on my wall is of Koshel Bracha. The Rebbe is looking into someone's eyes, filling up their cup with that very powerful, tender, loving gaze. And why that picture? And what does it mean to me? It's because when was Koshel Bracha? It came after a 2-day, sometimes a 3-day Yom Tov. And what was the Rebbe's 2-day or sometimes 3-day Yom Tov like? There was not a free moment.
Right, Sichas constantly.
I think Yossi Jacobson once said that if you transcribed all of what the Rebbe spoke on a 3-day Yom Tov, put it on paper, it could amount to 200 to 300 pages. One Yom Tov. And then, Matzah Yom Tov, what would anyone else in that position do? Take a little breather. Check out for a little bit. Without even skipping a beat, everybody gets on his feet, makes Havdalah, and gives out wine to thousands of people. Growing up in New Haven, we had time after Yom Tov to get in our car, drive 2 hours to New York, get in line, and still wait an hour or two to get Koshel Bracha. It's mind-blowing. I'm not even talking about the stamina. I'm not even talking from a human point of view. I'm talking about from a modeling what it means to be a shutef, an agent, a shliach of the Eibusher in this world. And to me also dollars is a similar point, except that dollars was 8 hours isolated.
Right.
It didn't come after 3 days or 2 days of incessant Torah teaching, being there for minyanim. That to me is just an amazing thing. And I think that a lot of this, dollars, if you ask yourself, what was it about? The Rebbe could have had Rabbi Gloner stand there or the Maskiros give out dollars. He did it himself. What was he doing? He was modeling. He was doing something very essential. I think he understood that our generation would struggle with a sense of self-centeredness. It is. We do struggle with narcissism and a bunch of other things. It's a reality. And the Rebbe was providing the antidote by his living example. He took every human being he encountered and he turned them into a giver. That was how he redefined a moment in time. Connection of two individuals, as he once put it, which should always bring about a benefit to a third. And that's the legacy. That's, Mazare b'chaim afu b'chaim.
Beautiful.
To the extent that we can channel that and model that and live that, not at the expense of
Abandoning yourself, yeah.
The abandonment of ourself and our family, of course. To that extent, we will, B'ezras Hashem, I think, in the hopefully imminent future, be able to hear from the Rebbe and all the Rebbeim and all of everyone going back. I'm proud of you guys. You brought us to the finish line. So
thank you so much for coming on, giving the guests what I hope they expected when they saw that you and I were sitting down for a conversation. I know you do others. I don't know if this was different, but
that was amazing. Thank you very much for hosting me, and also for, I think, really fleshing out some of these ideas that sometimes don't get to be deepened or accentuated in the way that I think you masterfully done, which is just amazing. Thank you for everything you do. Huge fan, and I want to bless you if I can to continue to use your particular life experience, skill set, personality, natural charisma, and ability to really penetrate to the essence in order to bring healing and rehabilitation, redemption, and serenity.
Thank you so much.
All of your viewers.
Thank you.
There's no doubt that you said before the what if. So if I could just wrap up on that, what if you hadn't struggled with the addiction that you had? I don't know. I mean, Hashem works in mysterious ways, but I don't think we'd be sitting here today in this format, and I don't think that the tens or hundreds of thousands of people that you touch and help would experience that benefit from you. And in that respect, I think you're an incredible example of someone who transforms some kind of pain into purpose, an element of challenge into a springboard for tremendous light and growth. And you have a special light, and Hashem should just give you the blessing, the power, to have the wherewithal to continue to do what you do and grow it and expand it, all in good health.
Thank you so much.
Surrounded by loved ones with serenity.
I appreciate it. And I did want to say, when you talk about the picture, that I appreciated a little bit of your talent, the picture of the Rebbe, right? Where to many it's be a picture, maybe of empathy, but how you extracted from one picture a whole story before and after. Like I saw how, like a certain point gets turned into a chapter. So I understood the gift in that moment, the gift that allows you to write these books and touch many people. And as you said, when two people sit down, hopefully a third is benefits. And I don't think a third is to limit to a third, but the third can be many more. So I hope that this impacts people